No one live. Are you gonna watch the Super Bowl, Sean?
Holy shit, that's... Welcome back, everyone. Hello, my fellow Westorians. Today is, here in the U.S., it is Super Bowl Sunday. Shay and I are not fans, but I know Sean's going to be watching. And that...
Absolutely, I am.
Yeah, right on. That got me thinking, though, that, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I think about when I'm listening to them. It's usually while I'm doing chores or driving around, which oftentimes driving around is kind of the same thing as doing chores. And I wonder where you all are listening. And since I know if you're here today, there's a good chance you are either heading out to a Super Bowl party later, or maybe you're catching this podcast edited version rather than the live stream, which, most of y'all do. The live stream's just a small fraction of total listeners. But I'm always curious how and when y'all listen. Occasionally one of y'all sends in a message and says, I listen every day while I'm driving around. Some of y'all drive around like a lot, like for a living. That's a lot of podcasts and audiobooks. Some of y'all have other job situations where you can listen, or maybe you're bedridden with an illness and audio entertainment has extra value there. So wherever you're listening right now, or wherever you generally listen, whether you're in the normal place or not, well, we're glad to be with you. Hopefully you have a tasty beverage with you wherever you're at too. Maybe not one quite so strange as what Sean's got, which is what today, Sean?
Georgian paste.
Oh, you really switched it up. Is it because of the Super Bowl?
Now, are you watching the Super Bowl? As everyone heard me ask.
I'm definitely watching the Super Bowl. This is like a deep blood red color. I guess you can't see it as easy, but I actually have a theme. It's not completely random. This time I have watermelon Mountain Dew mixed with watermelon Bang mixed with watermelon sparkling ice mixed with the rainbow naked drink, Rainbow Machine.
Whoa.
And as always, maybe more than normal, it's delicious.
So, but it all tastes like watermelon, right?
It tastes like Georgian paste.
I've always been curious what Georgian paste tastes like. Now I know. Make sure to check out goodqueenalley.tumblr.com. I almost said .com, which that's a really good...
Don't check that out.
That's a really good Conan reference. Conan worships the god Crom. So, wow, the internet would be a different
Conan
place.
O'Brien was atheist.
That doesn't mean people can't worship him, though. The internet would be a different place if it was .com instead of .com. Man, just think about that. Ooh, just for a minute, think about that. No, don't think about that. Think instead about what Harold Harding's two acknowledged bastard children are how they're likely to be treated, like class-wise. It's an interesting comparison to look at different bastards in different situations around the story and kind of guess or analyze how they're being treated based on the circumstances around them, because, of course, bastardy is... it's not... it's people don't get treated very well in Westeros, especially the nobles by other nobles, and if you're not highborn, well, you've got a whole bunch of other problems to deal with in Westeros as well. But that is the recent topic on Nina's blog, the most recent one. So I highly recommend checking it out and all the other things she's written. If you are a patron of History of Westeros, we highly appreciate it. You're locked in to get our bonus episodes and other content at the lowest possible rate. We are here in 2022 working on adding a lot more to our bonus episode catalog, which will eventually result in the price going up. Not very much, but it will go up. More content means, well, we should charge a little more for it. That's only fair. But if you get locked in now, your price will stay the same. We're not going to raise any prices on anyone who's already a patron. So get yourself locked in. Keep that price the same for, well, however long you want to keep it. You may have noticed today's name is The Rage of Heroes. It's our name for this episode on, of course, the Age of Heroes. In this case, it's not just me being unable to resist the pun, but that is part of it.
Is that a pun or a play on words?
Ooh. Good question. It might be a play on, I guess it is a play on words. You're right, that is a play on words. That may not be a pun. I'm not sure. I don't know the technical definition of pun, which is kind of a shameful thing for me to admit at this stage, isn't it? Maybe next week I'll do some pun research.
There's a lot of crossover. It's fine.
Well, in this case, rage has multiple meanings apart from the wordplay. We'll call it wordplay for now.
Wait. I just have to say, not to put too fine a pun on it.
Oh, nice. That was good. Good said. Good sung, maybe? It's kind of a lyric, yeah. But number one, it's another nod. Well, I guess number two, if number one is wordplay. Number two, it's another nod to the strong Greek mythical influence on this era, specifically the Rage of Achilles, that is quite literally contained in the first line of the Iliad, which is...
Sing, O goddess, the rage of Achilles, son of Peleus, that brought countless ills upon the Achaeans.
To be thorough, sometimes that word rage is anger or wrath of Achilles, anger. Same. It's the same word, basically. Achilles is enraged because even though he himself is a king, the king of Phthia, Agamemnon is the higher king, is the high king, and he takes the enslaved Princess Briseis for himself. In this era, too, we see high kings in Westeros, a title made obsolete by the Iron Throne, but before the dragons or even the Andals, well, there were also high kings during the Andal period, but not to put too fine a pun on it. When there were hundreds of kings, some kings ruled over others. That would be kind of a simple way to put it. Meaning number two has nothing to do with Greece or any other myth cycle. It's simply the slang version of rage, as in a trend. It's all the rage in this era for heroes and great deeds and those grand figures set trends that have lasted for thousands of years. And that is a big part of our focus today. Last time we talked about influences more. This time we'll spend most of our time in Westeros, despite the opening with the quote from the Iliad. We're going to be focused on some of the major figures, specifically Garth Greenhand, Lan the Clever, the Grey King, and Durin Godsgrief, most of all, but also a lot of the subordinate figures within those regions, their descendants. But also, we're going to spend time in each region when we get there. Like, we'll do a section on the Stormlands in the World of Ice and Fire, and as I've been saying all along, the world of the Age of Heroes and Dawn Age stuff will come back a little bit. But here, we'll take our opportunity to compare them, region by region, what the differences in culture and founding figures are within Westeros. So I think this is going to be a lot of fun. And even though I said it wasn't just about the wordplay, I've got some wordplay to kick us off.
Yeah, did any of the heroes ever get put in jail?
Well, where would they be kept, is what you're asking?
Yeah, maybe a cage of heroes?
Ah, yes, that's correct. But it's a good-smelling jail, a good-smelling cage of heroes, because the official herb of this era is Sage of Heroes. The people keeping that cage are well paid. They're the wage of heroes.
What do they earn?
Yes, the wage of heroes is there's duties that have to be done around the cage before the wages can be paid.
And they have someone do that for them, the page of heroes?
That's correct. And these events are portrayed by dramatic performers and actors many years later. Where
would they make such a portrayal?
I think they would do that on the stage of heroes.
Do you think any of them were magic users?
Like
The Mage of Heroes?
Oh, I see what you mean. What we need is a spell to make all these puns go away. That's the real magic we need.
We need one to make them stay forever.
Now, we spoke on how there's a belief that the Age of Heroes wasn't just a long time ago, but a time where things were different. That's somewhat true, somewhat isn't. It depends on who you talk to and depends on what aspect of life you're talking about. But there are substantial differences, even if they're not remembered accurately or portrayed accurately always. In this quote, which I think is particularly excellent, I stumbled on it kind of by accident looking for other stuff. It's not in the World of Ice and Fire. This is a quote from A Feast for Crows, but he describes the Age of Heroes vividly, seemingly unaware that he's living in the era come again, which is ironic because one of the big signs that the Age of Heroes has come back around again in the Iron Islands is the return of the King's Moot, right? That hasn't been seen since the Age of Heroes.
It's a good gauge of heroes.
A gauge of heroes. Nice. Very good said. Got me. And whose idea was it to bring back the King's Moot, mister? Well, it was Aeron Greyjoy's idea himself.
In exchange of heroes?
I've been hoisted by my own petard here. Aeron would say, well, it wasn't his idea. It was the Drowned God's idea. But Aeron was the vessel, the mouthpiece. So let's hear this nice, lengthy, awesome quote to kind of kick us off today.
On the crown of the hill 44 monstrous stone ribs rose from the earth like the trunks of great pale trees. The sight made Aeron's heart beat faster. Naga had been the first sea dragon, the mightiest ever to rise from the waves. She fed on krakens and leviathans and drowned whole islands in her wrath. Yet the Grey King had slain her, and the drowned god had changed her bones to stone, so that men might never cease to wonder at the courage of the first of kings. Naga's ribs became the beams and pillars of his long hall, just as her jaws became his throne. For 1,000 years and 7 he reigned here, Aeron recalled. He took his mermaid wife and planned his wars against the storm god. From here he ruled both stone and salt, wearing robes of woven seaweed and a tall pale crown made from Naga's teeth.
But that was in the dawn of days, when mighty men still dwelt on earth and sea. The hall had been warmed by Naga's living fire, which the Grey King had made his thrall. On its walls hung tapestries woven from silver seaweed most pleasing to the eyes. The Grey King's warriors had feasted on the bounty of the sea at a table in the shape of a great starfish, whilst seated upon thrones carved from mother pearl. Gone, all the glory gone. Men were smaller now. Their lives had grown short. The storm god drowned Naga's fire after the Grey King's death. The chairs and tapestries had been stolen. The roof and walls had rotted away. Even the Grey King's great throne of fangs had been swallowed by the sea. Only Naga's bones endured to remind the Ironborn of all the wonder that had been.
Boy, that's a great quote. It's so perfect for today, too. I mean, it talks about how great things were and how great they're not now, and the process in between. Some specifics as to how, like the burning out of the fire, the stealing of the loot, and the description of what people used to be like. It's really excellent. I love that quote so much.
Great to the perspective of Daron or an Iron Islander. Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, we're looking at this like, that's great to you? And it's super neat because this is a guy who truly believes it. Like, this guy is as a believer as it gets, right? I mean, he's a priest, a zealous iron priest. Of course he believes quite thoroughly. But take, say, Tyrion or Sam, someone who is an academic that studies these things either for a hobby or, because they're very deeply interested in this stuff. And they don't believe these things more than as a possibility. They're like, yeah, maybe really there were men that lived 300 years or 1,007 years as the Grey King did. But they're pretty skeptical about that. Aeron Dampere doesn't question it even a little bit. He's like, yep, 1,007 years, that's what happened. Period. No questioning it. Someone like Ned doesn't really think about it that much. He doesn't really question it that much either, but he doesn't define himself by the Starks of 8,000 years ago, other than the stuff that's still relevant. Like, winter is still coming, he's still Lord Stark, etc., things like that. Those still matter. He still has people to rule over, but he's not out here worried about whether there's wolf blood in him or how they behaved back then. He's worried about the problems of now, where Aeron's in the past, and well, that makes it interesting for us to compare and contrast. Like, he has lines like, men were smaller now, their lives had grown short. You have the line, only Naga's bones endured to remind the Ironborn of all the wonder that had been. And that's the thing I really want to hone in on, which is how these legends and how these artifacts left behind of that time inspire people, right? He says, that's the last line, only Naga's bones endured to remind the Ironborn of all the wonder that had been. But that's, to them, that is proof, even though the rest of the proof isn't actually there. This one piece of proof proves all the rest. So it's
gives it something to hold on to.
Yeah, so it is actually a pretty big deal to have something, to have one little piece from that era, a living reminder, or even if it's dead because it's made of fossilized bone or what have you, or even if that's what it was, it still works that way. It still inspires. And,
something else I can't help but think about too is the perspective of people like reflecting on the great days of the past. And, what he's thinking about is the few heroes.
Yeah.
But he's not accounting for all the people that starved to death or were murdered or whatever else. You know what I mean? He's just thinking about his idols. And so when he says men are smaller today, on some level, he might mean that everyone's only 5'7" and 150 pounds, and they used to be 6'6" and 280 pounds,
Yeah.
But on some level, I think he also means smaller, and that they're just fishermen in boats,
Yes,
or maybe some people are
absolutely.
even trying to farm. They're not off being heroes in war. But once again, those people who were farming are not starving. Their families are fed. They're not dying in war and leaving their kids, orphans and everything else. And he just has this, like many people, this fantasized idea of what it was like in the old days or whatever. It's not counting for the reality of a huge majority of the population.
Absolutely, yeah. You're not accounting for the cost. It's like selling out for this story, selling out for this idea, not considering all the other beings that must have existed. That's a fantastic point. And that brings me to a great take from Nina here. She says it's another example of how the present is a prey of nostalgia. The glorious time of the Grey King was something that happened a long time ago in an age that no one can go back to. It's an easy circular argument that keeps the Ironborn trapped in a state of nostalgia. Ever since our glorious age ended, we've gotten smaller and our lives have gotten shorter. And because we are smaller with shorter lives, we can't do all the things the Grey King and his warriors used to do. So even though they don't know how, they don't understand the cycle, they can look from a very simple, basic framework and say, we were doing better when things were like that, right? He's not thinking of suffering. He's not thinking of individuals. He's thinking of his people as a whole, and he views the successes of the top 0.5% as evidence of success of everyone, which is clearly flawed. Yeah. And if the Grey King was ruling really well and munificent and a capable administrator, well, then there you go. Then sure, yeah, let's get back to that time,
Then they would be less likely to get into war and less likely to get to the point that they're at now.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
When generation after generation, they send their people off to die in war and don't pay attention to stability in farmlands. Somehow now our civilization sucks. How did we get to this point?
Yeah. And so some of these ancient stories are lies. They're just straight up lies. And it's not necessarily the people in charge that are telling the lies on purpose. I mean, they're telling them, but in the case of someone like Aaron, he believes it too. He's not just being cynical and like, I can get these people to do what I want because of these stories. No, he believes it as much or more than they do. He's trying to remind them. He's like, yeah, part of the problem is they're not inspired. Part of the problem is they're not, their blood isn't up from hearing all these things. They're not brought to the table of the old way again. They're just like, oh, this is how it is. We gotta just exist. He's like trying to remind them of what they could be, even though he's probably pretty wrong about that. It reminds me of the show that many would still say is HBO's best show of all time. Game of Thrones has taken it over in terms of viewership numbers, which is The Wire. I'm pretty sure I've quoted this line before, but I think it was like 5-6 years ago. It's been so long, but it's super relevant here. And the line is, well, let me set it up. There's a couple of the gangs are going at it. They're about to have a big throwdown, essentially, and where people are expected to die. And it's based on the killing of a higher-up member of one of the gangs. Now, it turns out this guy was not killed by the other gang. But this character, Slim Charles, is like, when he's told that, he's like, oh, well, if it's a lie, we fight on that lie. He's like, don't waste the opportunity of everybody being fired up like this. This is power. You've got them where you want them. You can get them to do anything right now. They're so mad at our guy being killed. It's an opportunity. Strike while the iron's hot. Like 3 days from now, they're going to be
opportunity to sacrifice our people.
Yeah, right. It's an opportunity for these guys. Guys at the top of gangs aren't known for taking care of every little person. They're out for themselves. And he's right. He's like, yeah, this is a chance for us to make the power of the gang stronger. We may lose a few individuals, but the gang will be stronger if we act on this lie. Right? It makes us better. So that is
like. Who knows? In the world of people who've already decided to abandon morality, maybe they will be stronger, but they might not be stronger. They might be relatively stronger than the other gang, but people are going to die. You just said it. Never mind the attention they're going to bring from the authorities, and maybe it doesn't relate to Game of Thrones, but I don't know.
No, I think it does.
Frustrates me, the destruction that comes from violent action. I just wish they would put that to some productive action. You know what I mean?
You're right to point that out, because it's their belief that it'll make them stronger. They think that, right? It isn't necessarily true. It isn't necessarily 100% accurate, but it's definitely what they think. It's definitely how they operate. And that too is a pretty big deal. So with Slim Charles and The Wire, we come back to Game of Thrones and say, when we get to these individual regions, we discuss their founding figures and myths. Well, a lot of these lies, a lot of these stories support and enforce or prop up the people who are already in power. So of course they're going to perpetuate these stories. And to them, it doesn't matter whether they're true or not. It matters that it keeps them in power. It's like, well, who cares if it's true? We're gonna speak to it, and we're gonna emphasize the parts that keep us in power. We're gonna, if it gives us an opportunity to fire people up and get angry about something, if we can lie or grandstand and make them angry and use that to take out our enemies, we're gonna do that. And it gives them a value system to point to and say, hey, look, these are our values. And hey, look, our enemies have violated these values, or they have, offended our values. We should go fight them. And well, each of these different regions has different attitudes towards that, and we're going to compare and contrast that and other things. You might say, where's Brandon the Builder? Because I mentioned 4 of these major founding figures, and he should be right there with them as far as the great houses. But he's got his own pair of episodes. Yes, pair. I've been working on this episode so long that it grew so big that I had to chop it in half, like the Sword Ice, 2 parts. Scripted ones, so those are going to be pretty thorough, pretty fun, and they'll be out fairly soon. I got the Brandon the Builder is almost done. I got it only 2 paragraphs left. Night's King, we also have an episode on that. Night's King isn't a founding figure; he's just an important, legendary figure. And the Night's King episode includes information on Simeon Star Eyes and Night's Queen, who are, of course, other figures. And those are characters that we can deal with a bit later, because even though the Age of Heroes is not super well understood in terms of what happened when, like what was at the beginning of the Age of Heroes, what was at the end. Some things we can say for sure happened after the Long Night, and some things before. And so things that have to do with Night's King, things like that, we'll save for after, because next week we'll be taking on the Long Night. So, if you all have any patterns you noticed or any other questions, feel free, of course, to write us, submit them on the live stream, or send them ahead of time through Facebook or Discord or Twitter or westeroshistory@gmail.com is the email address. So unbroken great houses since the Age of Heroes, meaning since the Age of Heroes, they've been in place and have ruled the whole time. Stark, Lannister, you could almost say Durrandon, but not really, but the Durrandon bloodline still exists. It was just taken over by the Baratheons. And then you could sort of say the Grey King. The Grey King has so many descendants, but all the royal lines of the Iron Islands descend from the Grey King. So that one isn't really unbroken in terms of one house. It's just that tradition of being ruled by the Grey King's descendants is held. They just all come from one family, whereas they do in Stark or Lannister. or arguably Durrandon. Similar situation exists for Unbroken Capital since the Age of Heroes. Winterfell's been the capital, although they hadn't conquered all of the north back then. Same goes for Casterly Rock. It's been the spot. Highgarden, Storm's End. Now, the area is newer. For example, Sunspear wasn't the capital of Dorne until much later. It wasn't during the Age of Heroes, so those don't count. Age of Heroes bloodlines that are still extant. Of course, the Gardner bloodline is pretty much gone now. That's why that they're not included in the Unbroken Great House tidbit here. Stark bloodline. Yeah, go ahead.
You say pretty much gone. Are you just allowing for something that might still be out there?
Yeah.
Or do you know that there's some person? Or
it's just kind of impossible to believe that, given everything,
there's not anyone.
No one
Yeah,
ever.
yeah.
No one. Yeah, it's not known or it isn't specified. But certainly that house doesn't hold power anymore either. So I mean, the Tyrells claim descent from Garth Greenhand also. So maybe they don't come directly from Garth's first son, which is the line that started the Gardner house, but they would all have Garth Greenhand as their ancestor in that sense. So you still have that to fall back on. So Lannister bloodline is still there. It's quite quite well still there. There's lots of Lannisters. Like I said, the Durrandon bloodline is still there. There's not a lot of Durrandons, but they're there. The Iron Isles, of course, still going. Now, here's an interesting one. House Dustin. They're not a great house, but back in this era, they sort of tried to be, or in modern times, they connect themselves to that, which is they connect themselves to the High King, the first king of the First Men, a guy with no name, just that was his title. Some people, especially those in the Reach, argue that that is Garth Greenhand. Now, people in the North say, no, they're separate figures, especially the Dustins, but that's kind of another example of a bloodline that's been around since the Age of Heroes that's still there, that isn't necessarily holding great power now, but is still pretty formidable. I mean, the Dustins are important, but they're not the Starks. Although she certainly wanted to be. That's part of her story.
This is I kind of feel bad putting you on a spot here because this didn't even occur to me. I wish I had thought of this beforehand and even researched it myself, and it's almost a two-part question. In the world outside of Westeros, do we know what the oldest or most established or whatever house is? Is there some
in UT,
ancient Carthian family or what's that?
UT.
Yeah, the Yitish have, they're like a sort of an analog for China or ancient, what would have been called Cathay, which is what, people in the West called the lands of the East that they imagined as somewhat China-like. That would be a reasonable guess because China has...
They just have such a history.
And they're so good at recording it.
Yeah.
Like China has so much
Yeah,
recording.
we just, specifically in the Empire of UT, we know so much about, all these different emperors, Maroon Emperor. I feel like they know that they're descended from the Scarlet Emperors or the Maroon Emperors. I feel like they have that history because they are familiar with it. I don't know.
How old are those emperors compared to the Age of Heroes?
Probably older, but maybe similar.
Yeah, the Golden Empire is
probably older.
Yeah,
it's a range of time, I know. So.
Supposedly, the Golden Empire would have been after the first Long Night. Anyway, that helps.
Which would put it the same age. Like if the Long Night was a universal thing.
And it's 11 dynasties long, so that's a lot. It's a lot of thousands of years.
Yeah.
It says some Yitish dynasties lasted no more than half a century, whereas others endured for 700 years.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
The Long Night sort of just screwed up a lot of history, I think, is what it says. Yeah. It's like you may have had some of these things intact before the Long Night, but it was like a reset,
I think the Golden Empire would cross over with the Age of Heroes, so it would be contemporaneous with it, essentially.
We tend to operate over the Long Night being a global thing, which would have thrown a lot of these things into chaos or caused them to have to sort of restart. Or, if they didn't have records before the Long Night, then it's pretty hard for them to have like a cultural memory of what happened before it. If they wrote things down, though, that's different. And supposedly, at least some places in like Ashai and maybe ET had some written records before the Long Night, but that's something we'll be able to come back to a bit later. Certainly it is a part of the World of Ice and Fire, and that is one of the topics we've already got a guest lined up for.
Who's
So
the
I
guest?
appreciate you
Are you
humoring.
willing to tell
The
us?
guest is Chris Stewart from the History of China podcast, so he
Fun.
knows his stuff. He lives in China and is a China history podcaster, so he will, and he's read the World of Ice and Fire and all Game of Thrones stuff, so he'll have some good takes for us, I'm
Nice.
sure.
Yeah, but he's got all kinds of parallels we didn't key in on.
I bet you're right, Sean. I bet you're right. Yeah.
So, kind of a follow-up question to what I just asked, and I appreciate you humoring me, is what do you think the perspective of Karth, Bravos, other parts of the world, what do they think of, like, Stark's tradition, old house from the first minute, like, that's cute, or like, who are the Starks? Or like, they are a respected house. What do you think the perspective around the world is of these different houses?
I think they would
What do they think of Garth Greenhand? Are they aware of him as a legendary character or whatever?
I'm not sure that they'd be aware of Garth Greenhand. Maybe if there's anyone they're aware of as far as major famous like mythical figures, that would be one of them. But I suspect that they respect the power of these houses, but look on them culturally as savage, because they think their cultures are older, and that's kind of a common refrain, right? Like the nobles of one culture very often think that if their culture is older, then they're the more refined group. And the age of houses is such a fallback to superiority, right? That's kind of a universal thing in the real world too. Of course, in modern times, wealth matters more than blood in a lot of places, if not most places. Blood doesn't matter nearly as much as it used to, which is a good thing, I suppose. And some of these houses, you can see what happens when these bloodlines go extinct. Gardner is extinct, as we said, or mostly extinct, and because of that, it's maybe has made the closeness of lineage to Garth Greenhand matter even more, as without the Gardners around, it's not clear who the top house is, and so there's a little squabbling that happens. You don't have an obvious number one. People have to fight for it. Nina points out that Casterly could be another example like Durrandon, where if one of the various stories about Land the Clever is accurate, that he married in, or whether through trickery or forcibly or what have you, he married the Casterlys and they became the Lannisters. So that would still be technically, that would mean their bloodline is part of that. Now we have also, but otherwise the Casterlys are gone. The original king of the Vale supposedly was the Griffin King. That was his line. The Bronze Kings of House Royce are still around. Not the kings, but the Royces are. But the Griffin King, that's just like a couple of lines. We don't know what the deal with that is. That's a really ancient, not well-remembered story, but it sounds kind of cool. We don't know whether there was any griffins or if it was just like a cool stylized thing or what have you. But if George wants to tell us more, I'm all ears. Big, floppy griffin ears. Wait, what kind of ears do griffins have?
I think they have don't they have lion ears?
Yeah, I guess
Aren't
they do have lion
Yeah, like
ears,
pointed. Yeah, I don't think floppy.
I was thinking of elephant ears on...
Oh.
My griffins have elephant
Yeah,
ears.
I guess you can make whatever kind of griffin you want.
So other bloodlines that are still extant, meaning, extant and extinct, or, when you're saying those words, you got to enunciate very clearly.
Pronunciate.
I can't even pick the right words, let alone say them clearly. So Bolton, for example. Bolton's been around since the Age of Heroes. They were kings to start off, and they had to bend the knee to Winterfell, and it's apparently still the same bloodline. Umber. Manderley is super interesting because they were bloodline Age of Heroes that moved from the south to the north. We've got 2 whole episodes on them, and they should still be somewhat original, I suppose. Blackwood also have episodes on them, also 2, and that's another one that did kind of the reverse. They moved from north to south rather than south to north, and they should still be OG in that sense. Bracken right there with them, basically, without the move from the north part. Redwine, Tarley, Florent, House Ball, House Peak, House Beesbury, House Bulwer. A lot of these reach houses especially, but a lot of them just around. This is by no means a comprehensive list. If there's some that you think are your favorites, go ahead and tell us why.
My favorite is House Beard.
That brave stance of never shaving is really speaks to you, huh? They were very disappointed with our ad last week. So
you can still trim with that stuff. You
can
can still trim and
trimming
not
is
shave.
okay, just not shaving.
Yes.
Now, some of the founding figures are godlike. That's one of the things I think that sets them apart above. It's something that enables them to say, hey, we're the most powerful of these ancient houses because our founding figure was a god, whereas yours was just someone cool, which is not as fancy as a god, right? The Grey King lived for 1,000 years, had a mermaid wife. Garth Greenhand had many wives and a huge variety of supernatural deeds. Duran marries Elenai, who is the daughter of goddess of wind and god of the sea. So that's interesting, right? There's more god's blood on that side. And Brandon supposedly descended from Garth Greenhand, possibly not, but has greenseer powers and an extended lifespan, just like almost all these others. Lan the Clever, his descent is either from Garth or from the Andals, or just nobody knows. And he also has the extreme age. All these figures have long lifespans. It's like Lan's is like the shortest of like 300 years. I guess Duran's isn't specified, but possibly his was longer. But go ahead.
There are a lot of characters in the Bible that are like the super long ages.
Yeah.
And like Methuselah, it's almost like I don't know, the word you use for someone who's super old. And he was like 960 years old, but he wasn't like by far the oldest. He wasn't some weird rare exception. Like several characters were 900 something years old. Noah, I think, was at least 700 years old, and a lot of them like had kids at age 500 or something like that. You know what I mean? So, and there's a lot of interesting things surround this. One is that the Mesopotamians believed that living to be 1,000 years meant you were divine. And so the thought is that as they were writing the Bible, they were deciding they can't be over 1,000 years because that means they're divine, and they're not. There's only one God. But they were really special people, so they were almost 1,000 years old. That's an idea behind it. Some people think that maybe it was they were measuring months or something instead of years, and that makes the lives a little bit more reasonable ages. But when some of them had kids at age 500, but some of them had kids at age 100, which means they would have been like 10 years old when they had kids. So that doesn't quite add up either, So anyway, you can imagine. Some people think it's literal and they just live that long. There's theories about how maybe the atmosphere was different or their diets were different or whatever. Yeah. But one thing I find interesting, and kind of see this in this mythology, and George's mythology, and most mythologies, is very male centric. You know who the oldest woman in the Bible was?
Is it not Eve?
127. Okay, like all the men were like 1,000, and all those women's only 100, and they hardly even mention any of the women's ages in the first place. Like maybe they're older women, but they never tell us. So, and we kind of see like all these heroes we're naming. I think there are a couple.
Sean,
women.
Have you never heard you don't ask a woman her age?
Apparently, that's an old tradition.
Yeah, established in the Bible. Yeah,
that's pretty funny.
But in the Bible, these 1,000, hundreds, 300, 500, 900-year-old ages, that's kind of conservative. A lot of other mythologies, they lived thousands of years. That's a little more common in other cultures, Chinese cultures and stuff. They had people live thousands of years. So,
yeah, that's pretty cool. That's good. I'm
merely 900 is more reasonable. I don't know.
Yeah. Only this is a little bit, right? I really appreciate takes like that because I wasn't raised on the Bible, so a lot of these stories that a lot of people know pretty well. They've known since a young age. They went right over my head. George would certainly know them, though. He's comes from a Roman Catholic family and in an era where the Bible was a lot more prominent. Certainly, he
another idea.
I wonder, little George wondering about that, like 700, like talking to his like school teacher, like 700-year-old person, like what the heck's that? How did that pop? George is asking like 12 questions, and they're just getting sick of him, like, shut up, kid. Like that's how it was. Yeah, just accept it. He's like, nah, I'm not gonna just accept it.
Another idea, which again relates to the histories here, is that given the idea that maybe the Bible is trying to like create this history or send these messages or maybe even establish its own validity, right? That having these super old ages allows the potential for characters from generations to have talked to each other.
Mm.
So it's possible that like
Yeah.
Noah and Adam were contemporaries of each other if they both lived to be 800 years old. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so it kind of connects those old stories to more new characters or bloodlines. You could see the same thing here and how it would, why there's a certain value to these characters being older. It means it gives a connection to the generations, to the different families and cultures and stuff.
Yeah, and it also makes the figure that they're tracing their descent from just more imposing and powerful. It's like, of course, the descendants of this person who lived 1,000 years and set up everything about our culture. He's responsible for this and that, all these things that we have today. Of course, we should revere him. Of course, we should the people
name our kids after him.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then that just that morphs into the people closestly related to him are the ones that have the greatest right to rule, and the people that have that are rich and powerful and keep that system in place. But you're right to point out the overwhelming maleness of it all. Even the figures who are female, like the descendants of Garth, are generally just known for who their children are. Oh, that's true for a lot of these men too. But still, it's true. Just they're often not assigned other deeds. And even in the case of, say, Elenai, who's pretty important, we don't know anything about her other than that she abandoned her parents and gave up her immortality. And there's not much else about her, right? So you'd think she would be pretty interesting, but they're more concerned about descendant from the man, because that's just how these laws work, right? The laws are the firstborn male inherits, etc.
To be fair, during God's grief, like we don't really know much about him either.
Well, yeah, that's true. I guess the people...
we know he built the castle.
Yeah,
like that's a thing he did. But and maybe his name is evocative.
Well, they don't name things after her. You know what I mean? Like the castle. Like maybe if we had a close look at Storm's Eye, maybe this would be Elenai's Gate or something like that.
Yeah,
but you know what I mean? Like
that's
Durin,
true.
there's a billion Durins.
Yeah, true.
The name just comes up. I don't know. Like they don't name. There's no Elenai Baratheon, right? Like that name that I know of.
Wait.
Or is there?
I thought there was an Elenai, not Baratheon, but maybe I'm wrong.
Because that we were just talking about naming your kids after them. Well, there's tons of Durins or that last name, but was this? I don't know any Elenais. Maybe there is one. I just didn't know. Or similar names like L.A. or Ellen or something like that.
No, I think there's just I'm just thinking of the different ones that are Ellen inspired, like Ellen Baratheon.
Part of that
not
is
like it could come from Elenai.
Yeah, that's what I think. That's just what I was thinking of, because there is an Ellen Baratheon.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe that might be a relation. Yeah. Elenai is pretty similar. Yeah.
It makes sense that would be a root form. There's
But there also isn't, say,
there's Elenda. Ellen.
I had one in my mind just a second ago and I've lost it already. But yeah, the point being I think there's part of it is they don't want to inspire young women to be great. They want to inspire them to have children and be docile. So you don't see girls named Floris either. Like Floris the Fox is a big important character. I don't know anyone named Floris.
Yeah, I don't think you should name your child Floris.
Yeah, I guess that one, she's known for having 3 husbands and eat secret from each other. So maybe that's not something to aspire to. But that's part of the point. Like that's the thing they remember about her. And if a man did that, though, they would aspire to,
they would name their kids after him.
So yeah, so the double standards are. I mean, they're familiar double standards. These are ones that exist in the real world. So they're traditional. They're traditional double standards. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oops. Now, if we
the way, Nina does point out there are a couple Floris. There's Floris Baratheon even.
Okay, cool. I guess I'm selling her short a little bit, but yeah, there was a Floris. Wasn't that during the dance? Was that one of
the daughters of Boros? Yeah, there is
daughters. Okay, yeah. So they occasionally happen. Okay. But yeah, it's not. And some of these, to be fair, George hadn't invented the name Floris when he wrote book 1. If he had, there might be a Floris in book 1. So that's also part of it. These legends have been fleshed out over real time as well. But you'll notice in all this talk, we didn't mention really the Riverlands. We barely mentioned the Vale and Dorne because they don't really have similar figures right there. Like the Vale's founding figures are either the First Men versions are gone and thus not propped up by the ruling Andals. They would encourage people to forget that stuff if they aren't connected to it themselves, which they're not. Or in Dorne, where there's no unifying grand Dornish figure. until Nymeria, right? Nymeria is exactly that, but she is way in the future from where we're at now. And House Uller, they don't have a god or even a founding figure. House Ironwood, the most powerful house in Dorne for so long. There's no first Ironwood. They don't remember his name, at least not in a way that's written down for us. So it's super interesting to look at all these differences and different ways this comes out, different things that they value within each region and each culture, and how that still impacts the current characters and what they put forth as values. So let's talk briefly about syncretism. Specifically, the definition of syncretism is the combining of schools of thought and or beliefs, particularly theology, mythology, and religion. When it happens in culture or art or politics, it has a different name. For culture or art, it's eclecticism. And for politics, it's syncretic politics. So it's, same word. There's a lot of it in Westeros. A lot of it is regional. Let's start with a real world example. This is one that's particularly familiar to a lot of y'all, which is Christmas. Christmas honors the birth of Christ, right? But in practice, it contains a lot of traditions that have nothing whatsoever to do with Jesus. For example, I'm sure Jesus doesn't care if you deck the halls with boughs of holly or pile that tree with fun ornaments or sing all about it. But those songs celebrating said decking of halls and the rest aren't exactly hymns, are they? Ask Jesus, he'd say, yeah, that's got nothing to do with me. There were gifts at Jesus' birth, or at least not long after. So that's an example where the two traditions have some overlap, but it wasn't, gold, frankincense, myrrh, and holly. And the three wise men gave those gifts without wrapping them or placing them under a tree, right? They were just, here you go, as far as we know. Maybe they did wrap them, but I don't think so, because I don't think wrapping paper existed back then, but maybe they had it in a little bag or something. I don't know. Now, Christmas trees do often have a star on top, and that star commemorates the Star of Bethlehem, right? Which guided the three wise men to Jesus when he was born. Jesus then took the myrrh, used it with the frankincense like MacGyver to bring down the Star of Bethlehem. Then he forged dawn and gave it to the people who went on to found House Dane. And he did all that in the morning, which is why it's called the Sword of the Morning. No, but you see what I'm saying? Like these...
I didn't know MacGyver lived back then.
Right? See, you learn a lot by listening to our show. And I think that's really neat because there's just things that people want to do and they associate it with something else they want to do with their religion or what have you. And I have no problem with that, but it is fascinating how things that don't really belong get mashed together sometimes. And we just kind of say, yeah, okay, that's how it works. For example, go ahead, Sean.
I was going to say, especially the more time passes.
Yes.
The more you forget or don't care or aren't taught about the roots of it, for better or worse, but you still accept it as part of your culture, your traditions, your ceremonies. And when more and more time passes, we could go on and on about like the Greeks and Romans and even like the Egyptians. A lot of the Mediterranean mythologies are all kind of like bled together. They absorb pieces of each other. I think there was maybe even was like a belief among people that there were the same gods and different cultures had come up with different names for them. But even that idea is a little challenged because there were definitive differences between like Venus and Aphrodite. But now we just think of them as one was Roman, one was a Greek, but they were very different.
Yeah.
But they were also very similar. So
yeah, both. Yeah, a little both. Yeah, it's super interesting to me. And one thing to add on to what you're saying there is that the values have to keep up. Like if certain values of a religion become pretty unpopular, they have a choice to make whether to keep that orthodoxy or whether to change with the times and sort of adapt and stay current, stay relevant, and keep up with what the young people are doing without compromising too much, or they lose the old guard, right? And that's just a lot of back and forth. I mean, for example, not to get too real, I won't get controversial about it, but like the Catholic Church is constantly under fire for not adopting some more modern values. And they're of course under a lot of pressure to continue to be the same types of Catholics that they've been for 1,000 years or what have you.
It's worth noting that they don't ignore modern values or changes or whatever. For example, they've accepted evolution.
Yeah, not wild. I mean, not all of them have.
Excommunicated Galileo. Yeah. Well, yeah, but the pillars, the policymakers, if you will, of the Catholic Church have said evolution is not incongruous with our beliefs.
Right, and which it's not, right? It doesn't seem like it should be. It's like, why not say, God did that? God made evolution. There's no reason why you can't believe that, as far as I'm concerned.
I think that I'm hesitant to to give the credit, but I think even like the ages of these old characters, Noah and Methuselah and all, I think that officials have said, it could be symbolic of something else. They might have meant something different by the word year at that time. Like we can reconcile this in ways that make more scientific sense.
Which makes sense because they shouldn't, by sticking to the literal stuff, that's where you get so much disagreement. That's where so many problems have. It seems better to be flexible with these interpretations because that's when you don't have these big disputes. That's when you don't have splits within churches because, yes, there's syncretism of different religions. There's also schisms within single religions, right? Protestant versus Catholic. That's basically comes down to disagreements on the orthodoxy, like what these interpretations are. A lot of that, of course, there's
probably more splits within Christianity than any other religion. I never thought about that before, but just think how many scores and scores of even versions. How many different Baptists there are, like even divisions within the divisions,
And they usually aren't like at war with each other. Obviously, I mean, I don't even know if that needs clarifying, but obviously sometimes they are. But most of the time they just, I don't believe that. You do, and then you go about your day and the other person goes about their day. But when you get back, taking it back to Westeros, sometimes it just doesn't work. Like there's just some versions of some religions are just naturally so orthodoxy or they just don't have flexibility like the Iron Islands. There was an attempt to consider the drowned god as an aspect of the stranger for a while during the Targaryen era, but that did not work. I mean, the drowned god, it just doesn't work very well. It doesn't lend itself to mixing. It's preaching destroy everyone else, so it doesn't really, there's not a lot of wiggle room there. And the lack of, for example, on the other end, the worship of the old gods seems to have syncretized, if that's even a word, pretty well. It seems to have just been kind of absorbed fairly well. I mean, there was problems. Don't get me wrong. There was burning of werewoods and all sorts of issues. But in the long run, it seems to have reached a point that it works together, right? And I think part of the reason is there aren't priests of the old gods out there arguing and preaching and saying this is how it is. There's no one to argue it. There's no text to interpret. You can all, it's by nature, a bit more flexible. Whereas the drowned god stuff, they also don't have anything written down, but they do have priests, and those priests within the Ironborn culture have a lot of power. And so they're not about to say, they're not about to compromise so easily. I'm also glad you brought up Greek and Roman stuff, Sean, because there was Roman Christianity, not to be confused with Roman Catholicism. But Emperor Constantine, perfect example, he was pro-Christian, but he also encouraged worship of Sol Invictus, a.k.a. the sun. You're not supposed to worship the sun in Christianity, so,
Does he shut up about the sun?
So you can see he just kind of like tried to make it work by like, I think people will go for this. They'll go for merging these concepts together. And if they don't, well, we can change it. 80 years later, after Constantine, pagan worship was banned outright, which is a pretty big change from, trying to mash some of the stuff together and include it. So yeah, like you said earlier, Sean, the era and what the people want have a lot to do with it. But sometimes the people want something because they get tricked into wanting it, or they get propagandized or conned into it. Yeah. Now here's another example, but now we're back in Westeros. Arianne 2, The Winds of Winter.
Arianne had once heard her father and Maester Kellyan arguing with the Septon about why the north and south sides of the Sea of Dorne were so different. The Septon thought it was because of Durin Godsgrief, the first Storm King, who had stolen the daughter of the sea god and the goddess of the wind and earned their eternal enmity. Prince Doran and the Maester inclined more toward wind and water and spoke of how the big storms that formed down at the summer sea would pick up moisture moving north until they slammed into Cape Wrath. For some reason, the storms never seemed to strike at Dorne, she recalled her father saying.
I know your reason, the Septon had responded. No Dornishmen ever stole away the daughter of two gods.
So let's get this straight. This Septon, who worships the Seven, is saying the sea god and goddess of wind are mad at Durin and his ancestors 10,000 years later or what have you, right? 8,000 years later. So see, that's kind of odd, isn't it? Like, does he really believe that, or is that syncretism? I'm not sure if it's even syncretism. It's just it could just be two beliefs coexisting, right? The Seven doesn't have anything to do with this tale at all. There's not he's not involving the Seven in this. He's just accepting that this happened before they were around, or I'm not sure. And it's not that important for us to decide which is syncretism and which isn't, because the point is how to understand what works in Westeros. So this is, whether it's syncretism, whether it's overlap, whether it's coexisting, doesn't really matter which term you apply. That the point is that's how it works here. And I think that's really neat. It's its own brand of that. Nina says, I actually do like to think that this is an example of syncretism between the Faith and the Age of Heroes, that maybe the Faith views Durin as a sort of virtuous pagan, a man who defied the false gods of the sea and wind and who chose Storm's End, might be seen as a sort of bastion of faith against these false religions. Even though Durin was obviously not a follower of the Seven, the Faith might have seen his story as one where the hero recognizes an earlier polytheistic religion as false, refuses to worship it, sort of prefigurement of the triumph of the Faith over the worship of the old gods in Westeros. Yeah, kind of like how over time you see who won out over time. The Faith is current and strong and present because they're the ones that the cream rises to the top, that kind of thing. Maybe that's what the Septon is saying. What were you going to say, Sean?
Yeah, one, I like Nina's thought there, that especially over time, as the Seven gain more of a hold on how the story goes in history, it makes sense that that's how they'll want to spin that, But I think the average person still likes the original myth story more. And just something I've been stirred up thinking about as we talk about this is that the way it works, you said basically in Westeros here, seems, even though it's not exactly synchronized, syncretic, or
yeah, I think that's it.
Is that, at least for the most part right now, that they just coexist. Like, people constantly say the old gods and the new, right?
Yeah.
That's not really blasphemous. And I imagine maybe the priests of the Seven don't really like that, but they kind of have to accept it because so many people think of it that way. But I feel that people more in the north, or maybe the Dornish, people who more in the fringes, they're more okay with the idea of, like, we have our old gods, but it doesn't mean yours can't also exist.
Yeah,
right?
right.
Like, sure, there could be a drowned god, and all these gods, yeah, they're all out there. We just worship these particular ones, but all these are out there. I think the Seven are a little bit more like, there aren't any other gods. You certainly shouldn't be worshiping any other gods, but they're not like cracking down on that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
In some cases,
smartly.
Yeah, they probably couldn't. There's just too much. Those beliefs are just too much out there. You can't just deny that Durin ever existed when the ruling house of Storm's End calls themselves that. It's like, it's just not gonna. There's zealotry, and then there's zealotry that just no one's gonna even respond to. It's just like, yeah, that's just, no one's gonna believe you. So let's get into the first of our figures. The man they claim to be the first men of the first men. Some people claim that anyway, so he's a good place to start. An example of this very thing. There's all sorts of overlap or syncretism or coexisting with Garth Greenhand. Let's start with a quote.
1,000 tales are told of Garth in the Reach and beyond. Most are implausible and many contradictory. In some, he is a contemporary of Bran the Builder, Lan the Clever, Durin Godsgrief, and the other colorful figures of the Age of Heroes. In others, he stands as the ancestor of them all. Garth was the High King of the first men, it is written. It was he who led them out of the east and across the land bridge to Westeros. Yet, other tales would have us believe that he preceded the arrival of the first men by thousands of years, making him not only the first man in Westeros, but the only man, wandering the length and breadth of the land alone, and treating with the giants and the children of the forest. Some even say he was a god.
Well, that would explain, if he was a god, it would make a lot of that rest of that stuff make sense. Yeah, so in addition to the Green Man appearance, he's got a variety of other aspects. Let's have a little art of Garth Greenhand. George R. Martin himself by Michael Klarfeld.
Yes.
Currently on screen.
Garth R.R. Martin, George Greenhand.
George R.R. Greenhand, yeah. However you want to say it. They all We need name syncretism here.
Yeah, this is a fun piece because Michael used a photograph of George when he was a fair bit younger for this. So he's, a young man.
So another Greek myth that vaguely applies here is Dionysus, who wandered all over and planted vines. That's an aspect of Dionysus, is that he's a stranger. He comes from the East. So even to Greeks, he wasn't necessarily born in Greece. He came from elsewhere and brought his fancy plants from there and spread them here and then elsewhere. And that's very similar to what we hear about Garth Greenhand, isn't it? Maybe less focused on the wine part of it and the partying aspect and the mystery aspect, more on the fertility and growth and humans surviving in a wild land, but definitely some familiar aspects. And one of Garth Greenhand's is Gilbert of the Vines, who also has a little bit of Dionysus too, because he's very focused on the wine aspect. So not just fertility, wine, and agriculture, but this traveling part. That's the part of Dionysus that gets forgotten, I think.
We showed some art of Gilbert of the Vines earlier. I had a little slideshow that played of the different children of Garth Greenhand, and Aziz's podcast partner Kyle of Fandom Media and Podcast of Surprise is Gilbert of the Vines. So
that's right, Kylebert of the Vines, Gilbert of the Kyle.
Yeah.
And so, of course, if it wasn't clear, what I meant by the wandering part is, coming across the Arm of Dorne. So going from Essos to Westeros, if Garth was supposedly, in some traditions, the first one to come across, then that would be a similarity to Dionysus and other wandering real-world figures or other traveling figures. I guess Odin was a traveler too, for example, although he wasn't spreading fertility. He more spread stories and things like that, but still, certainly an ancient tradition of travelers. Hat tip to our friend Crowfood's daughter, who points out another connection. In the Gallo-Roman religion, Cernunnos, was a deity depicted with antlers, seated cross-legged, and in association with stags, horned serpents, dogs, bulls, rats, usually holding or wearing a torque, and has been seen either holding a bag of coins or grain and a cornucopia. So again, just spreading fertility, having antlers, all these things. So there's dozens of varieties of this being Cernunnos, but tends to be Celtic. Again, the spread of agriculture knowledge is really big. Now, you wonder, is that offensive or demonic to the children of the forest? You know how Aaron says, the drowned god is the only real god. All these others are just demons. He doesn't, kind of like the Durin Godsgrief example, he doesn't deny that they exist. He denies that they're worthy of worship. He denies that they are gods and instead says that they are demons. And yeah, I wonder, like a guy that is working against nature to carve out all these things that prevent nature from going in their place, like perversions of nature. I wonder if that's like they look on him as evil. What do you think? I mean, he supposedly acquired their powers and worked with them, but that doesn't necessarily have to be true. I don't know. It's just kind of a conundrum to me. What do you think? Or maybe I'm just overthinking it.
It's at least possible, and what I want to spin it positively, that they're impressed, like, oh wow, we didn't realize you could do that with nature. That's how I would like to.
He wasn't cutting down trees, so there's that.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Okay.
Maybe they even have some respect for his power, like, whoa, you can manipulate nature.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Or if he truly was, like if he was one of the green men that came from the pact, well, then he would be a respectful figure. He would be something that emerged from that agreement, and they would want to honor that. They wouldn't want to break their end of the deal. They wouldn't want humans going back to chopping down trees or what have you. So if he's associated with
it seems like he couldn't have been too evil or perceived as too evil for his legacy to be so positive.
Yeah, he may have done some bad stuff, but it looks like the good outweighed it, or the bad wasn't so much, as you say, to take over as the narrative.
Yeah, because we just really don't hear anything bad about him.
Not really. No, not really. Yeah. Basically, things that he does that seem kind of like he shouldn't do are written as explicitly good. Like having, sleeping around with so many different women. It's like, no, the women wanted him to do that because he's magical, and so their children will be stronger.
There's not really any Zeus rape stories with him.
Yeah, you're right. It's not. He's not convincing or conning these women, which Zeus does.
Yeah.
Zeus pretends to be. He shapeshifts and is like, aha. Yeah. Yeah. There's none of that. You're right. Garth Greenhand is not listed as a shapeshifter. Now,
you need to just do it once. Nope.
Nina writes, Garth Greenhand uniquely seems to have survived as sort of a fertility god figure, even while the first men worshipped the old gods, almost as a sort of dual worship. Highgarden, for example, was literally founded around a throne supposedly planted by Garth Greenhand, yet it also contains a god's wood with 3 werewoods. I wonder if that is because Garth Greenhand's legend is inevitably tied up in teaching the first men how to farm, quote, making the land bloom, so to speak. Given the importance of agriculture in the Reach, perhaps more than anywhere else in Westeros, it makes some sense that the people of the Reach would be reluctant to surrender their cultural memory of the figure who brought, or is supposed to have brought, the knowledge of agriculture to them. 2, because the children of the forest were not farmers, worship of Garth Greenhand could perhaps be easily reconciled with worship of the old gods. The deep forests, not particularly prevalent in the Reach, are the place where we worship the old gods and respect the children. The open fields are the place where we venerate Garth Greenhand and farm. Yeah, that's true. They don't overlap each other too much. There isn't like dispute over which sort of zones of nature or aspects of living that they control, which is such a common way for naturalistic religions to view the world. Like there's a river god, over in the other river there's a different river god, this forest has a god. So this separation that Nina's describing here makes a lot of sense to me. She also writes, this dual worship might have been made even easier with the pact when the land was clearly and by mutual agreement delineated. So they actually have like this children of the forest zone and the first men's zones, so that kind of delineates the old god's space and Garth's space in a sense, which I like that thought a lot. Then she says that might go for some of Garth's legendary children, too. The children of the forest were never beekeepers or winemakers or archers for the same type of archers, or certainly not type of warriors, but first men needed those skills. So they would look to their ancestral heroes through Garth as the ones who enabled or taught them the things that gave them livelihood, that allowed them to survive in this wild land. Here's another quote about Garth himself.
Where he walked, is that where we're at?
Yeah.
Where he walked, farms and villages and orchards sprouted up behind him. About his shoulders was slung a canvas bag, heavy with seed, which he scattered as he went along. As befits a god, his bag was inexhaustible. Within were seeds for the world's trees and grains and fruits and flowers.
Nice. It's a bag of holding, huh?
Yeah.
So you D&D players out there, that was like one of the items most sought after, because if you have a bag of holding, all of a sudden you don't have to care about logistics anymore, right? It's like, oh man,
my least favorite D&D item.
Yeah.
Logistics matter.
Not with a bag of holding. Yeah, it get kind of crazy with just like everything of holding. It's like, no, my pants have pockets of holding. I got a backpack of holding. I got a water bottle of holding. Yeah, just infinite everything. So yeah, I really like what Nina wrote there about that. That's kind of delineating the zones and how cultures would have seen those things. Sometimes I forget how distinct like forest versus meadow versus brook are in these old viewpoints, how separate they are as like their own regions or what have you, like miniature micro regions or whatever you want to call them. And the concept too of making the land work for you, and how she brings out what the Reach's source of power is. The fertility of the Reach is what gives it such great power over the other regions. Wealth, population. So of course they're going to celebrate that. It makes sense in the same way that you can't just forget that the Stormlanders value Duran. You can't just forget Garth Greenhand. So everything has to kind of include him. It all starts with Garth. I wish there was George had included some figure, like, what's that thing that...
Some figure named Wayne?
Yeah, exactly, yes.
Is that where you're getting?
Yes, I wanted a Wayne. Like, a Wayne is W-A-Y-N. It's like a type of cart, like a... I don't know.
You want a Wainwright?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, George...
Wayne the Wainwright?
George will throw in some Muppets, but he won't throw in Wayne and Garth. So, yeah,
Pretty on, Garth.
Yeah, that's right. Farm on, Garth.
Farm on, Garth.
Yeah, so didn't that bag really... I know we mentioned this briefly last time. Isn't that bag thing sound like the old stories of Johnny Appleseed, just having a bag?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, because he's such a major figure in the Age of Heroes, that's why connection to him might be more important than the Age of Heroes figures in other regions. Right? We were touched on that, how it really matters to have descent from Garth Greenhand in the Reach. Whereas in the North, you don't really see people clamoring to connect themselves to Brandon the Builder. It's kind of just accepted. It's kind of just understood. Yeah, the Starks are connected to Brandon the Builder. There you go. Like, you know what I mean? There isn't, maybe it hasn't come up, but you don't hear a lot of that. It doesn't seem to be a part of the cultural wrangling. You know, they're not like, we're closer to Brandon the Builder than you are. You know, it just doesn't seem to matter.
I wonder if maybe it's because they're, I'm trying to think how to say this. The North is more connected to each other than the rest of the realm.
Okay.
Does that make sense? And all of them are maybe a little closer in their ages or connections to the past. So like our house is, 3,000 years old. Our house is 3,040 years old. Where when you have the other in like the Reach or the other more southern areas, our house is 400 years old, or our house is 3,000 years old. Like there is more to hold over someone else. There's more different groups of more different ages. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Nina writes, it's interesting to note the sort of mythical propaganda that the Gardeners crafted with the legend of Garth Greenhand. The Gardeners were no strangers to using mythical descent to support a claim to worldly power. After all, according to E. Yandel, it was, quote, that kinship, the supposed descent of House Gardener from Garth Greenhand's firstborn son, Garth the Gardener, that gave House Gardener the primacy in the centuries that followed. For, quote, no petty king could ever hope to rival the power of Highgarden, where Garth the Gardener's descendants sat upon a living throne, the oaken seat, that grew from an oak that Garth Greenhand himself had planted, and wore crowns of vines and flowers when at peace, and crowns of bronze thorns, later iron, when they rode to war. Boy, that's evocative. That is really cool. Guy's like aspect of peace and plenty. He's got his aspect of war with the thorns and all that. That's neat. I like that. She continues here by saying that the Starks were descendants of Brandon of the Bloody Blade, who was a younger son of Garth, and Brandon the Bloody Blade is either Brandon the Builder's father, grandfather, something like that. And then by saying the Lannisters are descendants of Florys the Fox or Rowan Goldtree, the Gardeners might have been making a subtle claim, perhaps imperial claim, over the North and Westerlands. After all, we know during the Age of Heroes and during the time of the Andals, there were a lot of attempts for the Reach to expand. Given how much wealth they have and large population, you can kind of see why they would think they could. They would assume that they're stronger than a lot of these neighbors that they have. And this would maybe be long-term granting of casus belli for themselves. Be like, look, if we have this legend out there that says Garth Greenhand is the father or ancestor of Brandon Stark, then that gives us claim to the North. And, maybe they're not going to use that tomorrow. Maybe they're not going to use it in a week, but they might use it in 100 or 1,000 years. And yeah, if it's there, then it's on the shelf for them. And it's interesting to see how they made sure it applied in a couple different spots, right? It applies to the Lannisters, it applies to the Starks, it applies all over the Reach. Big powerful houses like the Hightowers and Beesburys and Cranes and Bulwers and all that. So that's maybe kind of difficult to pursue a claim in practice, like saying because of 8,000 years ago we can do that. But it would enable them to, if they took the throne, if they conquered the North or won it somehow, they would have a foot in the door as to their legitimacy. And then they could, work to establish that, to cement that any way they could. Any response to that, Sean? It's pretty cool stuff there, huh?
Yeah, maybe I was spinning on the idea that, like, if you can keep your people really invested in this, that could rally them to war if the time came for it.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe they had thought of that in the old days, and then, they had designs on the North, maybe when it was more recent to the Age of Heroes, and the stories have lingered. They never got their act together to invade the North. Or maybe they did, and they were stopped at Moat Cailin, because it is awfully hard to do that. It's really hard to invade the North. No one's ever really done it. So that would possibly, it was tried, and that was part of the basis for it, was these ancient family connections, or maybe they said, hey, look, you want the North to bloom and flower like the South? Well, you're going to have to follow this lead. And if you're a northerner, that's probably part of why you said like the North is more self-contained and has less connection to the South. Like, what would all that mean to them? Like these stories of this blooming and the vines and all that. They're up in the North freezing. Like, that does not resonate.
Yeah.
Like, that is another world down there. These are different cultural people, different upbringings, different dangers they have to face day to day, just different lifestyle, different, yeah. So very different. So returning to the first king, that's why there's in part the dispute. You can really see how the dispute breaks down along political boundaries. The people in the South are like, yeah, the first king was Garth. People in the North are like, no, the first king was some entirely other guy who came over before Garth. Y'all are just trying to give Garth's stories to the first king. Okay, well then what was his first king's name? I don't know. And it is kind of weird. Like a king, like what kind of king leaves all that for a realm that doesn't even exist? Like he must have been like, it might have been like Nymeria. It might have been that kind of scenario where they couldn't stay anymore. Someone else came and conquered them or was pushing them and they left. That is, after all, why the Andals came to Westeros. They were being pushed by the Valyrians. They couldn't stand up to them very well, for obvious reasons. They didn't have dragons or, blood magic or what have you.
Yeah, it could have been a harsh winter or a volcano or a
yeah, that's true.
Plague,
climate change. Yeah, like we talked about back several episodes ago, they're just following the herds. They gotta, that's what their sustenance. So you got to go where their sustenance is. If the fish, if you rely on fish and all of a sudden the lakes are empty, you're moving, or you're dying.
Yeah.
Yeah. And on the other end, we talk about how Garth versus the North, Garth versus the farther south, Dorne. They're like, nah, he's not connected to us in any way. We don't care. None of that's got anything to do with us. And there doesn't seem to be any dispute over that. Maybe some houses in the Reach are like, oh, we know Garth just ignored their land because it's so pathetic and sandy. or some of them might think, yeah, no, Garth, his influence is there too. Their bloodlines are on, which is.
I mean, I feel like they would probably say something like, well, obviously Garth wasn't there. That's why it's so sandy.
Yeah.
If he had been there, you would have good land.
That might be a better way to look at it. Yeah, just the
you
more
were not
straightforward,
blessed.
like
they weren't
the thing I
blessed.
just said about the North. Like, yeah, it wouldn't be so cold up there if y'all had Garth.
Yeah,
you'd have better plants. He'd have gotten you some winter roses and winter apples and winter wheat and all these amazing plants. Just leave it to Garth.
Instead, they get lemons.
Not a single Mountain Dew in sight. No bangs, no Garth Green bangs.
Oh, there was a lot of banging.
No, there was a lot of banging. Yeah, Garth did a lot of banging. Yeah, green or other colors. Speaking of a lot of banging, Robert Baratheon. Funny that the Tyrells are less closely related to the Gardeners than some of the Reach elite. Remember I believe later in this episode we have an Olenna quote sort of along those lines. But what's happening at the beginning of the book is that they're trying to rearrange things, right? They're plotting to get Robert to divorce Cersei and marry Marjorie, which Robert has a lot of Garth Greenhand parallels. All these children, the horned antlers. In our Brand of the Building episode, there's a whole section on this. And Robert also, kind of like Garth, just kind of goes where he wants, sleeps with who he wants, and parties. Like, that's similar to Garth, right? He just, because he's the king, he's like, yeah, I want to go down in the crypts. Like, imagine if some other visitor's like, I want to go down into your ancestral crypts and do stuff. You'd be like, you wouldn't even ask that. That's offensive. But Robert, he's the king. He goes where he wants. He's the 800-pound gorilla, 800-pound Garth. And likewise, he has a ton of children out there. It's not entirely clear which ones are his. Some of them don't even know they're his. And that when he does end up marrying the Tyrells, or rather his family ends up marrying the Tyrells, it's not his family. It's the children that aren't actually his children, which is a great metaphor for people claiming descent from Garth Greenhand when they probably don't have descent from Garth Greenhand. Here we have people claiming descent from Robert Baratheon when we clearly know those are Lannister kids. So I appreciate the bookending, the paralleling of Robert to Garth So yeah, you got to wonder, maybe, history is written by the winners. We don't hear, earlier we brought up how no one brings up Garth being this lecher, no one talks about him. He's not portrayed as a rapist or as a Chad, but Robert is by current characters. We see that. That's definitely what Robert is. Maybe maybe it's just history has made Garth look like a gentleman or like someone that the women threw themselves at, when in reality he was kind of a skeezer. Someone who was aggressive and tried to touch people inappropriately. He was always like grabbing people and trying to get them to drink more and that kind of thing. They wouldn't, if that was the truth, would they really write that? This figure that they're trying to stand in front of as a symbol of their nobility. So I don't know. There's a strong chance that Garth is, if he was even real, he was kind of scummy. I don't know. Just want to throw that out there. I'm not going to say it's the truth, but let's be.
I think it's less likely. Again, maybe I'm being too optimistic about it, but I think that, like I said, if it was too bad, I feel like he wouldn't have come to. Some other person would have taken on all this legendary, past role rather than him. But as soon as I say that, I realize that Robert, we kind of know he's scummy, but I don't know if that will be his legacy, right? Like, everyone doesn't necessarily know he was sleeping around. He's probably just going to be remembered as a great warrior.
Yeah, that's true.
He became king, and a lot of the other, less savory details of his life probably won't get remembered or written down, or especially if the Lannisters stay in charge, they don't want to be tainted by his bad part of his reputation.
Yeah, whereas, like, for example, if Edric Storm or Gendry, or if one of his bastards took over Storm's End, then his infidelity would be remembered.
Yeah, or they might try to smooth it over or whatever. They would emphasize the good. They would emphasize what you just said about how he made friends with everyone. Even his enemies became his friend. Like, that's a pretty good story to tell, and it's pretty accurate. Yeah. They would leave out the drinking and the sleeping around, probably, or at least make it sound like what it is with Garth was women just threw themselves at him.
Yeah.
It's like, sort of. Kind of.
Robert easily could be abusing his position, but we haven't really got stories of rape from him.
True, that's true.
Although he was violent towards Cersei a couple times.
Yeah.
So,
but apparently not sexually, because that story of her, she could always just easily fend him off. Like, he was gross and pushy, but he wasn't like, he also hit Joffrey, so he hit people. But we're not trying to defend. Not saying he's not violent, but maybe. Anyway,
at that time, though, in this world, those wouldn't necessarily be marks against him.
That's true. Yeah, in this 10,000 years ago, that would really not be the kind of thing that people would. Oh my God, he hit a woman. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that would. In those savage times, that such things might not.
I mean, like, even in modern days, 100 years ago, that wasn't.
Yeah, you're right. I'm wrong to act like this is not still happening too. Obviously, it still does. Yeah. It's just not as. It's just in public, everyone knows it's wrong. It's people still get away with it in private all the time.
Yeah.
But I think what we're saying here is maybe 10,000 years ago, even in public, it wasn't necessarily wrong. It might have been something like, "Yep, well, he was disciplining his wife in public. That's a man's right." Rah, rah, rah. Yeah, that kind of thing. So, we don't know, but there's a lot of possibilities, and it's interesting to throw them around and see how they sound. So, some of his descendants, there's so many, we're not going to go through them all. We mentioned Florys the Fox, and her deal was that she's apparently
a total smoke show.
The founder, indirectly, of House Florent, Ball, and Peak. And those are really major houses. And we've talked about them at various times and various episodes. Currently, the most powerful of those three is House Florent. Ball and Peak have both fallen down the ladder quite a lot. But the Florents are still pretty powerful, although going with Stannis is also threatening to reduce them down to a lesser house. But Florent, you can see the name is more present there. Florent, Florys, right? It's pretty straightforward. And they do have the
Ball
Fox
is relevant too.
What's that?
Ball was relevant too.
Ballin'.
That's a different perspective, but okay.
Fireballing.
Florys was balling. Yeah, fireballing. Yeah. Now, interesting too that as Garth's descendants come down the line, you look farther down in the ancestry, they seem to specialize a bit more. And a lot of them are still associated with fertility, like more specific rather than just generic farming and fielding and agriculture. You have Ellen Eversweet, who had a pact with the king of the bees. Is this a human who is king of all the bees, or is this a bee, like a queen bee but a king?
Yeah,
with a crown. Like this one's really throwing me here more so than I think it should. It doesn't really deserve this much attention. But I'm really thinking of this king of the bees. For one thing, a king of the bees in Westeros is like, wait.
I kind of picture it in the same line of some of the skin changing stuff that we get with some of the other characters, like Rose of Red Lake. I mean, we just get multiple skin changing examples, and so the idea of Ellen Eversweet interacting with the bees makes it seem like she could communicate with bees. I don't know.
When they talk about skin changers who are birds and how they kind of just stare at the sky a lot, and how just flying just kind of becomes their identity, and the sky becomes their identity. If you ever skin change into a bee, you're like, yeah, even when I'm in human form, I'm just constantly buzzing.
You're just humming.
Just a noise all the time, just present. Speaking of buzzing, Gilbert of the Vines would be another example of that, with a specific aspect of nature. Wine, of course. Then we have apples from both Fossaway and Rowan. And now here comes a real weird one. Here we get into some of the supernatural ones. The other descendants are less about fertility and agriculture, and maybe two different categories. There's the knights, who are anachronistic, and then we have these supernatural ones, which, let's start with those. We have Harlan and Herndon, who are the brothers of Horn Hill, so Sam and Randall's ancestors. What a weird story. They both married a woods witch, took turns with her, and she gives them extra life, like allows them to live longer as long as they only like sleep with her at midnight or something like that.
Original throuple.
Yeah, the original thruple. Yeah. Bizarre, man. Really weird. Like, what value are they espousing here? What is the I really don't get this one. It's cool in its way.
Maybe it's a cautionary tale.
Okay. Yeah, maybe. I don't know what to make of that one. It's pretty cool though. Next up we have
maybe the woods witch was just really hot.
Yeah, she was a super hot woods witch, or she was using a glamour to seem super hot. Bors the Breaker was the guy of House Bulwer, and he gained horns after drinking the blood of 20 bulls. So he got strong after drinking blood. Now that, I think the symbolism behind that is a lot more striking and dark. Blood drinking, blood sacrifice to gain strength. That's what that says to me. That's where that's aiming at. And it's like, ooh, because we have lots of stories of sacrifice, especially tied to the pact, to the children, to the worship of the old gods, even as recently as a few hundred years ago, possibly still happening on places like Skagos, as Roose Bolton says. So this is a thing that might connect north to south, these cultural traditions of old gods and blood sacrifice. So that to me is what this is suggesting.
We got some nice art up here I've been showing of all the characters, by the way. And this one is of our good friend Dom Sartalia from Folkwise stream. So
yeah, shout out to Dom. How you doing, buddy?
Looking buff in this art. Like a bull.
Yeah, as a bull, you better be looking that way. Buff bull, Bors the Breaker. We also have Rose of Red Lake of House Crane.
I recognize her.
Yes, I wonder why. Is it like looking at, is that you or is it Lady Gwyn?
It's me.
It's you. I couldn't remember. Which one is Lady Gwyn?
She's not any of the Children of Garth.
Oh, okay.
She's on the Iron Islands map.
Oh,
I'm
that's
also
right.
on that one, but no, she's not a child of
Garth. Some of people in the fandom are in multiple spots, so I forget sometimes. So that's really neat. Just more skin changing in the South, more legends of animal skin change or animal skin changer, as opposed to what?
Well, yeah, Hodor skin changing, I guess.
A tree. Yeah, I'm going into the table. I'm a table skin changer.
Some bark changing.
Yes, I am now becoming one with my thermos of coffee. It's not enough for me to drink it. I must become it. So I don't really have anything to say about Rose of Red Lake. I just
She's
appreciate
beautiful.
Yeah, she's beautiful. Beautiful. The most loveliest of all the descendants of Garth. Or
yes.
just most loveliest of all, period.
Yes, thank you.
But do you skin change? Can you? But you don't like birds. See, this is the problem here.
I know.
Shay hates
You wouldn't
birds.
call me out. I hate birds.
The irony.
Yes. So now turning our attention to the knights and stories of tournaments, which are the most obvious examples of perhaps syncretism or just rewriting history. It may not be syncretism either. I'm really unclear on what qualifies exactly as syncretism or something that's just similar to syncretism. Anyway, again, it's not important. The concepts overlap all over the place here in Westeros. So we have John the Oak, founder of House Oakenshield, or Oakheart rather, and he's the first knight. Just like knights didn't exist for thousands of years later. Speaking of, Argoth Stoneskin, aka the Grey Giant, wins the first ever tournament in Westeros. Now, tournaments don't have to be about knights, but that's the only time we ever hear about them. We were specifically told that martial contests in the north are melees, not tournaments. Now, which does at least show that there were other forms of this, so maybe this isn't an anachronism, but it seems like one. And she married Uthor of the High Tower instead of Argoth Stoneskin. She was the prize of the tournament, because apparently women can be prizes in tournaments back then. And Nina writes, I like to imagine that Owen Oakenshield, who, quote, conquered the Shield Islands, driving the Selkies and Merlings back into the sea, was the legendary ancestor of House Manderley. Assuming that the Manderleys did not change their sigil when they came north, which the Tollans did around the time of the Targaryen conquest, just as an example, then perhaps their family symbol of the merman pays tribute to Owen's triumph over the Merlings. Yeah, I like that idea a lot. I also like the idea that they had a greater association with the sea, because of all the artwork associated with House Manderley is ocean stuff, like leviathans and krakens and all that. So there's definitely room for them to have maybe started off a little closer to the coast or something like that, which is something we talk about in our House Manderley episode. But yeah, more knightly stuff. Serwyn of the Mirror Shield isn't descended from Garth Greenhand, and he's another one we have a whole episode on. But not only is he called a knight in the Age of Heroes when there were no knights, but people nowadays say that he was in the Kingsguard. And the Kingsguard's only existed for 300 years, so that's just like the most blatant rewriting of history. It's like, who would believe that? Well, a lot of people that are illiterate. That's who.
People that want to believe it.
Yeah, people that want to believe it are like, yeah, I like that. Or people who don't care. They're like, yeah, that story sounds good to me. So Nina also says maybe since he's not a child of Garth, maybe the legends might say he was a son of John the Oak, or since John the Oak was the first knight, maybe his descendants were some also knightly. So yeah, that all works. Nina also says, speaking of syncretism, I would not be surprised if the faith co-opted the stories and imagery of Garth and some of Garth's children for its own religion. Images of Garth, John the Oak, and Maris the Maid could very easily turn into images of the father, the warrior, and the maiden. The story of Rowan Goldtree might be turned into a faith story. If Rowan's lover left her for a richer rival, then maybe the faith would say the maiden gave Rowan a golden tree as a sort of reward for her purity and virtue, and the moral of the story would be that these are as important as the faith, or to the faith, as material wealth. On the flip side, some of these stories would doubtless have been bowdlerized by the faith, since Flores' story might become less about polyandry, which the faith doesn't condone, obviously, and more about simple cleverness, while Harlan and Herndon's mutual sexual relationship with the same woman might have been left out, maybe suggesting instead that the beautiful woods witch was really the crone in disguise who gave them wisdom, which helped them reach that older life. This is a great, great take. The way, the cleverness, the marketing behind the specifics attempts to syncretize some of these old figures with the very open-ended aspects of the Seven. Which is important, right? This is something that Septon Maribald reminds people. It's not seven gods. That's kind of a common misconception. It's one god with seven aspects. And within those seven aspects, there's a lot of wiggle room for different faces and features and garb and demeanors and day-to-day things. So, yeah, really well said there, Nina. Unless you have anything else to add, we can move on from Garth, take some questions, and then move on.
We can move on.
This is my chance to mention that if you want to find all of this art of Garth Greenhand's children on a lovely map of the Reach, you can go to claridox.de, and there is a section on the Reach.
Yeah, yes. And so, yeah, some of y'all are obviously listening to this and aren't able to see the images, so we want to make sure you have the ability to go find them. Matt Reese sends a donation, says, thanks for all the great content this past year. I hope this little amount helps out. Appreciate that, Matt. Very much so. Matt's a regular on our Friday game streams, and he's one of my top advisors. Gives me lots of great advice, helps me keep track. So much to keep track of in that game, as Shay, as you well know.
Yeah.
It's really a luxury to have a group of regulars who make sure I don't make mistakes, or at least try to make sure I don't make mistakes. Can't stop me from making all of them. Some of them get through. Anime lover Nicole says, celebrated my birthday this afternoon. Well, happy name day, anime lover Nicole.
Yes, happy name day.
Yeah.
Happy name day.
She was talking about how she made a delicious 3-layer cake.
Ooh, very nice.
Ooh.
Very nice.
It was 1 layer lemon.
Garth would be proud. Julie A says, question for the panel. Thoughts on the continuation of the Stark name? Seems risky since it's just Rickon unless a guy takes Sansa's last name or Jon takes Stark. Yeah, and with Jon being dead, like, it's not even clear if Jon can procreate, so I'm not even sure about Jon.
Yeah, I think it's just an example of, Sansa's going to continue the name.
Yeah, kind of like how we've seen that in other cases. For example, the Bael the Bard story. There was no Lord Stark didn't have a son; he had a daughter only. So yeah, and that's a fairly regular thing. The rules of matrilineal inheritance, or the rules of patrilineal inheritance, include this exception, which is when there are no males to inherit, it goes to the daughter, the eldest daughter, and the house name. When it's a powerful house like this, the man, it becomes a matrilineal marriage. Again, referring to something familiar to people who watch the game streams on Friday, since we do all sorts of marriage arrangements in that game, all sorts of dynastic connections and bloodline formings. So I would think Sansa,
it really just is. It's who's in power. If Sansa's in power, then she makes a decision to keep her name.
Yeah,
is really what it comes down to. If she wasn't in power, then the issue would be moot.
And it's not one of those things where the husband's going to be offended because in a male-dominated culture, he's like, I want my name to be. Nah, he's going to be like, yeah, I want to be a Stark.
I get to be part of the Stark legacy. Yeah,
yeah. That name's way more powerful than whatever his name is. Even if it's like,
unless it was a Bolton or some other powerful or respected house.
Yeah, then you might have an argument. But yeah, if it's just someone, then yeah, Stark isn't, because Stark is also the name that gives you claim to Winterfell. If you're like, no, I don't want to be a Stark anymore, it's like, well, then you can't have Winterfell. Like, oh, okay,
yeah,
I'll be a Stark then. Yeah. Stefan B says, this also makes me wonder, when did the First Men transform from Stone Age society to agricultural? Before their move to Westeros or only after, during the Age of Heroes? So this, of course, refers to Garth Greenhand sort of establishing all this stuff and the father of agriculture in Westeros. Yeah, when did this all happen? Were they still hunter-gatherers in Essos, or were some of these hunter-gatherer refugees or migrants, or did this happen in two different places? Like, was there a Stone Age revolution to kind of turn into the Bronze Age over in Essos, and that came later in Westeros, or maybe some of the Bronze Age exiles made it to Westeros? And that's a really good question. Yeah, obviously we don't have an answer.
It's a gradual process.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's not like all of a sudden in one generation, everyone stops hunting deer and starts planting beans. You know what I mean? It's like, even when you plant your fields, you're not going to harvest them for months. You still need food in the meantime. It's a gradual process to make that transition, and it wouldn't all happen in all places all at once either.
You probably see it take hold in certain communities, and then maybe if new communities form from those, and they follow along with what worked. And yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of cultural mixing even in ancient times in the real world. There's plenty of evidence that ancient mankind, even ancient Neanderthals and Denisovans, understood that incest was bad. Because of the results it produced. And so they would go farther out to find matches to have marriages. And when the point being in this context that when you're sharing brides and husbands from villages and you have to go a certain distance because you know that you want to have genetic diversity, then you're also going to learn about what that culture's doing. You're going to see, oh, look at this thing they're farming. Look at this tool they have.
Yeah.
And then you bring that back to your village, and then wash, rinse, repeat, right? Brendan Towngates corrects me on the pronunciation of Pecos. I said Pecos Bill. It's Pecos Bill. So thank you for that. I do appreciate being corrected. Everyone wants to be right, but I want to be right. I want to have. So that means I have to correct myself sometimes. I don't want people to think I'm right. I want to be right. That's the difference, right?
Technically right.
Yeah, I want to
the best kind.
I can't tell you how many times like I've wanted to say something like, okay, wait, hold on, I need to Google how to pronounce this.
Yeah.
I've never heard this word said out loud.
Yeah, it's only things like that where you don't realize you're saying it wrong. You're like, oh, I would have looked that up, but I thought it was. I've heard it said that way before, but it was passed on to me wrong, and I took it that way.
As long as you're doing corrections, I said something slightly wrong last week too. It's more of a personal thing. I said I wasn't totally vegetarian. I meant I'm not totally vegan. I am totally vegetarian.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that actually, I forgot about that, but it surprised me at the time. I thought what you meant was that you occasionally accidentally eat food. Eat meat. Yeah. Because I know you don't intentionally ever eat meat. You're just like,
my goal is to not do anything that kills animals.
Right.
So I will eat eggs or cheese, so that makes me not vegan, but I don't want like a leather belt, which is maybe a step beyond vegetarian. So
yeah. You're doing your own version of it, and it's consistent, and it makes sense. Yeah, when you explain it. Brendan Towngate didn't just correct my pronunciation. They also said, we, for sure, take on stories even now. One of the tenets of Hinduism, for example, is that Vishnu comes to Earth whenever there's an urgent problem that needs to be rectified, and that he comes in many forms. This is used to incorporate other religious figures into its own fabric, such as Jesus or the Buddha. Yeah, and this is just a general comment on how much our lives are not just contained by stories, but informed by stories, and how we live our lives according to things that happen in stories. I mean, again, we go back to the Bible. I'm not hating at all, but the stories in the Bible affect a lot of people's lives, and they live their lives according to the moral precepts that are expressed in those stories. And of course, those stories are open to interpretation, and that leads to a variety of outcomes. But the goal there is, pretty clear. And I do appreciate that. And it's very true about humans. We do love stories. We sure do. And that's part of why we're here. You can get more of our stories, of our analysis, more of our episodes by going to patreon.com/History of Westeros. We have scripted chapter breakdowns of the Feast for Crows prologue and the North Remembers a Dance with Dragons chapter. We have Where Are They Now episodes on Team Stannis, Tourney of the Hand, and Tyrion in the Vale to help you keep track of where the vast number of characters are at the end of the story. You may remember them, but you may not remember exactly where they're at. You know where Tyrion is, but what about like Shagga? What about Bronn? What about Loris's brother Garland? Do you remember where all those characters are? Well, if you do,
What about Dre?
Sure. Yeah, what about Dre? The whole world's forgot about Dre. And we also have Valar Rereadis by POV. If you don't want to just listen to the chapters in order and you want to focus on a certain character, you could listen to just all the Sansa chapters in a row of our analysis. We also have an episode on Gogossos, the city of blood magic. It almost became the 10th free city. We have an episode on the Red Kraken with our friends over on Radio Westeros, co-made. There'll be more episodes on that time frame containing that character and other characters associated with it. And as I may have said earlier in the episode, we are about to have 2 Brandon the Builder episodes. The main one will be for all. The second one, which focuses on the buildings and how they were built, that one's going to be patrons only. Also, to remind you all what I said before, our basic Patreon price will eventually go up. Right now, it's still the same. So get it in now, lock it in at the current price, and you'll be, that'll be the price you pay until you cancel. Now, we're also moving to make our podcast feed a little more manageable. There's just so many episodes on there now. We're removing some and moving some to be patron only to streamline everything. So that's another reason to sign up today. But that is all the cleanup I have. Let's get right back to the material. This episode is running a bit longer than I thought. We'll see how far we get. We may not finish all we had today, but that's okay. We can always just pick it up where we left off next time. But for now, let's head into a discussion on Lan the Clever, and we'll start with a quote.
In the most common version of the tale, Lan discovered a secret way inside the rock, a cleft so narrow that he had to strip off his clothes and coat himself with butter in order to squeeze through. Once inside, however, he began to work his mischief, whispering threats in the ears of sleeping Casterlys, howling from the darkness like a demon, stealing treasures from one brother to plant in the bedchamber of another, rigging sundry snares and deadfalls. By such methods, he set the Casterlys at odds with one another and convinced them that the rock was haunted by some fell creature that would never let them live in peace. Other tellers prefer other versions of the tale. In one, Lan uses the cleft to fill the rock with mice, rats, and other vermin, thereby driving out the Casterlys.
In another version, he impregnates various Casterly women without their knowledge. So this is a good example of what we were just saying before, is how they kind of smooth over something that's rape. I mean, impregnates them without their knowledge. I mean, that's just like, that's a really lot of words to say. But it is expressed literally without their knowledge. Like, they wake up, there's no sign of it. They don't feel like something happened in the night. They're like, gee, that was a very vivid dream. No, they don't remember it at all. They just become pregnant. Of course, that's what the story says, which that's pretty hard to believe, but so this is a good example of like the story smoothing over something that's a straightforward crime, crime against humanity, ethical, clear ethical negative. So, but they just like, yeah, it just happened. Like, it's just a story, so it's not the kind of thing that you would want to express, but just in general, Lan isn't, he's not heroic. Right? It's different the way he's expressed. He doesn't do things for other people like Garth. He doesn't make the Reach bloom, which is obvious benefit to millions of people. This guy's just like took over the building and now rules it, It's not, right? There isn't a whole lot of, look how great he is. Look how, they talk about how smart he is, but there isn't really an attempt to make him seem like a good person or a great warrior or any of these things. He's just in charge. Nina says, one aspect that I appreciate about Lan the Clever is how Yandel introduces the more fantastical explanations while also noting the more likely practical explanation. That Lan was a household retainer who married into the Casterlys and passed on the name. It's another way to show how these stories grew in the telling, and as time passes, the growing, things get, there's a lot of growing that after time passes. She says that what starts as a pretty ordinary female line transfer of power evolves into an elaborate story of sneaking through the tunnels, tricking the Casterlys into betraying each other, using elaborate means to drive them out of the rock. Yeah, like you just said a minute ago, Sean, or we were talking about the question from, who was that? From Julie about the continuation of the Stark name and about matrilineal marriages. This sounds like just a tale that could have just been a matrilineal marriage. Like, yeah, there was no son of Lan, or no son of the Casterlys, and Lan married a daughter, and
this time they didn't keep the Casterly name.
Yeah.
The inverse of what we were talking about, really.
Yeah, so they just, this was thousands of years ago, so the rules were a little different back then, or Lan decided to rename them Lannisters because he could. He was powerful, and, hey, this is my castle. It's not like you guys have been here for thousands of years. It wasn't established like it is now. So, yeah, that's kind of neat.
I wonder if at the time he was known as Lan the Frustrating. But eventually they wanted to make him seem more positive, and so Lan the Clever. And I do kind of appreciate having heroes that aren't through violence, you know what I mean? Now, maybe it was still through coercion or, immoral action. But I like a clever more than a barbaric,
Yeah, you don't want just warrior stories all the time, right? Yeah, it's also variety. Yeah. It would be kind of boring if it was just, and then he killed the king and took over. Yeah, I mean, it's like, yeah, we saw that one before. So yeah, it is. Yeah, it's good to have the variety. I totally agree with you there. Nina also says, it's again underlining how these fantastical tales can have real-world origins. That doesn't mean the fantastical couldn't have happened because this is a fantasy setting where magic is real and active, but it does imply that the legends start from somewhere. They could be fantastical. They could be mundane. They could be a little of both. There are 3 tales of Lan's origin. Like a lot of characters, he's claimed by Garth's line either through Rowan Goldtree or Florys the Fox. Westerners instead say he conned an inheritance from Garth's line. So instead of him being a blood descendant, he ripped off Garth. So we're using his cleverness. So that's the 2 disputed versions, kind of like the two versions of the first king, whether he is Garth or whether Garth came after him or what have you. And some would say he's an Andal long before the Andals came over, which isn't like the night thing of anachronism, because there's not necessarily a reason to believe that Andals didn't exist yet. They just hadn't migrated over. Now, quite possibly the Andals did not exist at this point. But if they did, somehow an adventure or two coming across and finding their way into Westeros is very much feasible, I would think. I don't see any reason why that shouldn't be possible, unless the Andals didn't exist. But the precursor culture to the Andals may have. Just someone with blonde hair and green eyes. I mean, right? It's not so strange. Some people think maybe he came even farther from the west, like all the way from Yi, where they had the different gemstone emperors, and that would explain
known for their blonde hair.
Yeah, the blonde hair. That would explain why this bloodline these genes are so persistent, because it's obviously not realistic in the real world.
I was joking, but the green eyes was the relevant part.
Oh, right, yeah, the blonde hair.
Like, Yi is not known for blonde hair, to be clear. Jesus was like, yeah, of course.
That joke went right over my not blonde hair.
Yeah, yeah, you're a real blonde.
But yeah, he is supposedly had green eyes, golden hair, lived to be 312 years old, 100 daughters and sons each. It's kind of like Garth Greenhand, where there's just so many descendants you can't keep track of them all. And there's also just no way you would ever think that the Lannisters are extinct. It's kind of gotten to that point where there's so many golden-haired, green-eyed folk around Lannisport and elsewhere that they do have these little mini distinctions, right? The micro border of Lannisters of Casterly Rock versus Lannisters of Lannisport. These divisions within the family, these hierarchies within the Lannister family. But it's kind of impossible to ever imagine that someone would be like, "Yep, I can take over because I wiped out all the Lannisters." It's like, really? All of them? Holy crap, man. It's like a genocide. But yeah, so let's talk a little more about this. Like, he's not... Like, you like the clever aspect, and I do too, but it's not common, is it? It's not... you see that occasionally, like, you see the occasional trickster god.
With his supposed mother, Flores the Fox, huh?
Yeah, mother. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's a good call. Yeah. There's also our favorite, or one of our favorite ideas that came out during the time of when the Blood Moon show was in development. Of course, that got canceled. We really hoped that, what's her name? The actress that was cast in that?
Yeah.
Who was that?
Oh,
I like that actress, but
I know.
Can't remember her name. Anyway, you can look.
Naomi Watts?
Yeah, Naomi Watts.
Thank you.
We were hoping she was a Lannister, and maybe she was Lan. We were hoping she would be Lan, like Lan's.
Oh, that's a cool idea.
As in the name Lannister is like a bastardization of the word Lan's sister.
Yes.
Lan's
yeah,
sister,
just generally,
Lannister,
the idea that
right?
Yeah, this woman is actually the origin of House Lannister. Yeah.
And given all this matrilineal marriage legendary, it definitely fits with what we know, or what it fits into what details we have. Like, it works as a theory in that sense. So I think that's cool. Okay. As a trickster, he perhaps most reminds me out of gods I'm aware of. I'm sorry.
This connects to what you're about to say. Actually, okay. The person you're about to bring up is Loki, who of course is gender fluid. Just the idea of Lan as a gender fluid figure.
That's a great point. Yeah, so in one tradition, Loki becomes a female and mates with a horse to give birth to Sleipnir, which is Odin's 8-legged horse. So yeah, Loki not only becomes female, but has working reproductive organs. Hey, that's being a god for you. So yeah, let's talk about Loki briefly, because Loki seems like part of the inspiration for Lan. The trickster god stuff fits pretty clearly. Loki was bound to a rock for part of his life. So Casterly Rock, there you go. Now, sometimes Loki is portrayed as having green eyes, but and red hair, but those are just artistic impressions. None of the texts say that. There is a tradition that thinks he was blonde, though, because he's described as fair. And fair, a lot of times in the ancient world, fair means fair-haired. But fair could just mean good-looking. So don't take that to be too far. Now, Loki also has very scarred lips from stitching. And he's a fire god, and he's a shapeshifter. Which brings us to our modern Lan the Clever figure, Tyrion, who also has a scarred face, not lips, but a pretty huge scar. Also has, similar hair. But of course, Tyrion's hair is less like the other Lannisters than Loki's would might be. But again, Loki doesn't necessarily have blonde hair or green eyes. The fire god, perhaps, is there's a connection there because Tyrion is obsessed with fire. Now, he doesn't have to be Ares' son for this to be true because he's obsessed with dragons anyway. Like whether or not it's in his blood, it's part of his story, part of his personality. Also, there's a lot of expectation that Tyrion will sneak into Casterly Rock. It happened on the show. He's the guy who cleaned the drains out. Like it's certainly a theory that's been around since long before the show did its thing. So if he sneaks lions into Casterly Rock, it could be like an army. I mean, I doubt Tyrion's going to go in by himself and just start swinging his sword around and be like, aha, I'm here. I made it in. It's me. I can do this myself. So bringing in Lion's men or something like that, or just other dudes to help him. How does that ring for you, Sean?
Yeah, it's certainly in the likelihood of how it'll go. Not him doing it by himself, and it's like a clever person is more likely to get the help of others than just charging with their battle axe.
He's proved that he's clever, and they want to benefit from that cleverness in the future, and and that is very true. Yeah. There's also Tyrion's promiscuity, which fits into some of this pretty well, more with Lan than with Loki, I suppose. But still, that works nicely. And then you wrote Lan the dwarf theory here.
Yeah, some people think just the fact that, Lan was able to slip into a cleft in a rock, might imply that, hey, maybe the original Lannister was a dwarf.
How about that? Yeah, that could make sense. Sure. And, I also just can't help thinking of Varys when I hear about little vermin being unleashed, mice and rats, and because are they birds, are they mice, are they rats, right? That's what he calls them. I mean, they're not literally any of those things, they're little children, but sneaking around and turning people against each other. I mean, that's Varys' modus operandi right there, right? Hiding in the tunnels, taking on multiple disguises. And Tyrion does that too, not as well as Varys, of course, but Tyrion is Hugor the Hill, and these, I'm forgetting some of his other nicknames, but Varys obviously has all sorts of disguises. Rollo, yeah, there's another one, yeah.
Hollow, something like that.
Yeah, Hugor and Yallo, that's it, yeah.
When Lan, if he brought vermin into Casterly Rock, he was kind of like the Pied Piper of Hamaland.
Oh boy, Hamalam.
Yeah, Hamalam.
Oh. All right, so let's move on. Unless we have anything else about Lan the Clever, let's talk about the Grey King, who helped us kick off this episode. Now he's going to come back with some specifics. Let's start.
Wait, Shay, is there any imagery out there of Lan the Cover and buttered up for the?
Yeah, Michael Klarfeld had wanted to make that for his Westerlands map, but the Westerlands map is still being created, so not yet.
He hasn't got the model yet to butter themselves
up. Yeah.
Need a good butter model. Gotta get that down pat. Oh boy, this is really slipping away. Okay, the Grey King.
Oh wait.
What, another?
No, I did. I'll put it in the. I'll download and put it in the image. I did find that there. I don't. When did Michael do this? Apparently, Michael does have art, the Heroes of Ice and Fire from 2016 that he did that shows Lan nude. I'm just gonna put it in the image. But
I don't remember this.
I don't either at all. So we'll see this in one moment, everyone.
Glad I brought it up.
I'm glad you did. It has in here.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess you can continue with reading the quote.
All right, Sean. Yeah, go ahead with the Grey King quote while the Lan art is.
It's brought up. It's on the screen now for y'all.
Nice.
Don't confuse this image with the Grey King. That's the Butter King. This is the Grey King.
Yeah, the Butter King.
The Grey King ruled the sea itself and took a mermaid to wife, so his sons and daughters might live above the waters or beneath them as they choose. His hair and beard and eyes were as gray as winter sea, and from these he took his name. The crown he wore was made The crown he wore was made of driftwood, so all who knelt before him might know that his kinship came from the sea and the drowned god who dwells beneath it. The deeds attributed to the Grey King by the priests and singers of the Iron Island are many and marvelous. It was the Grey King who brought fire to the earth by taunting the Storm King until he lashed down with a thunderbolt, setting a tree ablaze. The Grey King also taught men to weave nets and sail and carve the first longship from the hard pale wood of Yig, a demon tree who fed on human flesh. The Grey King's greatest feat, however, was the slaying of Naga, largest of the sea dragons, a beast so colossal that she was said to feed on leviathans and giant krakens and drown whole islands in her wrath. The Great King built a mighty long hall about her bones, using her ribs as beams and rafters. From here, he ruled the Iron Islands for 1,000 years, until his very skin had turned as gray as his hair and his beard. Only then did he cast aside his driftwood crown and walk into the sea, descending to the drowned god's watery halls to take his rightful place at his right hand.
So 1,007-year reign. That's kind of odd that they added 7 years on there, but
I wonder when that 7 was added. By the way, Could that be syncretic?
It could be part of that. Maybe that was a relic of their attempt to make him an aspect of the stranger. It's entirely possible. I like that idea. He had a mermaid wife, which, the drowned god apparently also did such a thing. And this is, when we get to Elenai, you're going to want to consider the similarity there of a being from the sea, sort of. Like Garth showed humankind the secrets of basic survival. So this is where he has a lot in common with Garth. Fire, fishing, and sailing are all attributed to the Grey King. So that's like Promethean. I mean, with fire, it's literally Promethean. With fishing and sailing, it's similar, because Prometheus stole fire to give to the gods, from the gods to give to humans, which enabled humans to make grand progress. Without fire, it's hard to do much. Now, in the Ig example, the demon tree, the pale wood of Ig, a demon tree fed on human flesh. That's super interesting to me because it really sounds like a werewood that people give blood sacrifice to. Fed on human flesh, right? That sounds very clear. Hard, pale wood. So that sounds like rejecting the old gods in the early days. That's what that sentence says to me. Is like this is a figure who did not fall into this new order, maybe established after the pact, where the first men started growing closer to the worship of the old gods, outright embracing it. This character not only rejected it, but he built a ship, which is also a rejection of sort of first men understanding, or at least a change from their attitudes and behaviors going to sea. And by the way, that's very much a Norse reference as well, because the world tree in Norse myth is Yggdrasil, and it starts with that YGG and then goes into Yggdrasil. However you say it, it's a really hard word to say, but George just was like, yeah, we'll just go with Igon. Egg. Yeah. It's just like egg. So, and again, there's no old books or temples for the old gods, but there are priests. But they have no idols. Now, maybe that's what the trees are. In the equivalent of for werewoods are the idols of the children of the forest of the old gods worship. But the drowned priests don't even have that. There's nothing. You can say Naga's bones are idols of a sort, but that's not the kind of thing you carry around with you. It's only that one set of them. There aren't like other versions of Naga's bones elsewhere, whereas werewoods are all over the place. So, it's a much different attitude, right? It's not just he's by far the most warlike of these major figures. The others are all like, and he has this too. Grey King has this too, very prominent. The fire, fishing, and sailing stuff speaks to that directly. These early figures are like, how do we survive in this world? In the north, Brandon the Builder built edifices that lasted forever, and then very importantly, he made Winterfell, which is where you have the hot springs, which are life-giving. It'd be really hard to live without those in the depth of winter. And similar to Garth Greenhand establishing agriculture, and when we get to Duran, it's more we'll have some examples there too, but all these different versions of how this person, this ruling figure, made life possible for his followers. Not so much with Lan, though. Again, that's something else that Lan sticks out. Lan was kind of just out for himself. There aren't stories about how well he ruled, or it's just how many children he had and all that stuff. But these differences to me are really interesting. What do you think, Sean? What's where's your head at right now with where we're at? Where are you at with where we're at?
Yeah. I think I think it's interesting, the parallels that he has to the different ones, like the long age and the sort of like advice for survival, if you will, but also the differences. And I think about this constantly, that the idea, when you look back at different history, mythology, religion, there's a lot of these very common threads, but then there's also these distinctions. And to me, that's the difference. That's like the common threads, or like the commonality among humanity, like around the world, different cultures, time periods, whatever. People are trying to stay warm, find food, they fall in love. You have these different things, but then there's differences depending on maybe how advanced your society is, or what kind of climate you live in. And that leads these differences in cultures, religions, and so on, in addition to how they like maybe affect and absorb each other. But you have some that are like in very different geographic locations that are unlikely to have been exposed and absorbed, but still have these parallels to each other. This is also specifically making me think about another thing that might have happened. There was a study a guy did a while ago. He had this idea that he was intrigued by this idea that some people are like very adventurous, adrenaline seeking. They like jump out of planes, and in old times maybe they would have like ventured out across the ocean. Nowadays they go to the moon or whatever. But whereas other people, like, they want to stay at home, they wash their hands, put your helmet on, like everything is careful and safe and stable. And other people were like crazy and wild and adventurous. He's like, how can there be such disparate personality types among humans? And he sort of concluded that it was maybe necessary for evolution, that you need to have people who are willing to go adventure. So when a drought comes or the herd moves, like, you have to have people who are willing to go find new water sources, who are willing to take chances, so that we can find new resources and migrate under duress and stuff. But you can't have everyone doing that, because we'll all end up dying because you're taking too many chances. You have to have some people who want to be careful and stable. You need both these types. So I imagine among the first men, the more adventurous come over to this new land, and they kind of blaze a trail for other people who want to be more stable and settled. But over generations, you keep having more of both these types. So some of them get on ships and go out to the Iron Islands. So they're going to bring with them maybe some elements or stories of the children of the forest, but maybe these more adventurous people are more likely to like want to distinguish themselves from that. Like, we're doing it our way. We have this more adventurous personality. Yeah. We're not going to worship trees that sit still all the time, right? We're going to worship this underwater god that brings the storms. So.
Constantly moving the waves. And that's a very different kind of attitude. Yeah. Huh. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah.
And it parallels their more destructive lifestyles rather than a more stable lifestyle,
Right on.
Anyway.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Cause adventure, and that's what it's like this culture. This is like the cultural version of that. Ironborn very much revere explorers. And it's almost partly reflective of what you're saying, too. The Ironborn don't have great natural resources and fertile fields and all that. So, but they also don't have the attitude to spread out. They recognize their home as holy, and it kind of has maintained that way. They've never tried to, well, I won't say never. Until the time of House Horror, they didn't really try to move their capital or change the center of their culture. But it did happen, and that's something we'll get to eventually. So we'll have to come back to this notation. We'll remember to connect these dots when we get to House Horror. That's, of course, pretty close to the time of the conquest. So we've got a while before we get there, but it will be fun when we do. A couple other random figures from the Age of Heroes. The Ironborn have a lot of Age of Heroes figures. A lot of them are just guys with cool names that were famous raiders. And that's really all there is to it. But a few of them have fun details that either remind us of things happening now in the story or are just cool in general. Balin Blackskin is a legendary Ironborn raider who supposedly lived during the Age of Heroes. He fought with an axe in his left hand and a hammer in his right, and he was impervious to injuries from any man-made weapon. Swords glanced off him, leaving no mark, while axes shattered against his skin. Who does that remind you of, Ashea? That's not the answer I was expecting.
That's who the art is.
Yeah, we have art of... There's Yoke Boy is the latest model for a figure from the Age of Heroes that's on screen.
I don't know if the answer you're looking for is Superman, but that's what I was thinking of.
The answer I was looking for is Euron. Who has his Valyrian steel armor that's black, so...
Black skin and an ironborn,
Yeah. Then we have Dagon Drum, who was known as Dagon Drum the Necromancer, which is like, what? A necromancer? Bringing people back from the dead. And we haven't even...
He was also known as the Handsome. The Necromancer kind of took over in history, but...
So here we see Sean Pink himself in his bearded glory as Dagon Drum the Necromancer. What's your favorite thing to necromance, Sean? Do you like as an Ironborn? Do you like undead whales or seals? Or...
Trojan.
You're consistent.
Keep repasting him.
Repasting, cut and paste.
Cut and paste, yeah.
Oh boy. So then we have Hrothgar. What now?
Sean was emulating the pose, the necromancy pose while he drank his drink, and it's like next to each other. He was just like really spot on. It was a visual gag.
Hrothgar of Pike is another Ironborn legend who supposedly possessed a horn capable of summoning krakens, which that's not the first time we've heard of a horn capable of summoning krakens. And of course, in Euron's case, he's got a horn capable of summoning dragons. Of course, Victorian actually has it now. But with necromancy, horns that summon giant animals, and, imperviousness to weapons, we've got like a bunch of guys that Euron is emulating all at once. So be aware of these cool parallels. Keep in mind when you're reading in the future what they may mean. And your experience will be all the greater for it. That's right. That's right. Let's move on. Unless you have anything else to add about the Ironborn or Grey King here, folks, let's go to our last major figure today, Durin, God's Grief. Quote,
The legends surrounding the founder of House Durrandon, Durin Godsgrief, all come to us through the singers. The songs tell us that Durin won the heart of Elenay, daughter of the sea god and the goddess of the wind. By yielding to a mortal's love, Elenay doomed herself to a mortal's death, and for this the gods who had given her birth hated the man she had taken for her lord husband. All parents do. In their wrath, they sent howling winds and lashing rains to knock down every castle Durin dared to build, until a young boy helped him erect one so strong and cunningly made that it could defy their gales. The boy grew to be Brandon the Builder. Durin became the first Storm King. With Elenay at his side, he lived and reigned at Storm's End for 1,000 years, or so the stories claim.
So this 1,000-year claim is a little interesting too. I mean, it's similar to the other 1,000-year claims. Elenay, being a daughter of a sea god and wind goddess, is probably the fanciest bloodline of all of these. And Nina says it's not quite it's more fancy than marrying a mermaid, but it does have similarities. She says it's sort of a prefigurement of Argella Durrandon, as Durin was not a god or demigod, but incorporated a divine bloodline into his family thanks to his marriage to Elenay. So Orys Baratheon was not a lord, but incorporated the royal Durrandon bloodline into his family thanks to his marriage to Argella Durrandon. So yeah, it's kind of like history repeating itself, with Orys bringing the Targaryen bloodline into the existing Durrandon bloodline and sort of taking all that on for himself and his descendants.
Yeah, it's funny because Orys is more of the demigod-like figure there.
Yeah, he's like maybe related to the Targaryens.
Yeah, exactly, with the Targaryen heritage.
Yeah, which is more explicitly magical in its current time frame, because obviously if there's any magic left in the Storm King bloodline, it's probably pretty minor. Maybe it's just the appearance. Like, you still have people that come out looking like Robert. 6'6" with giant blue, big eyes and huge strength. And Renly looked like that too.
Well, I guess, part of the question is also what Orys look like.
Yeah. Apparently, Orys was black hair would have had this look, but part of it, some of it anyway.
But yeah, in terms of it being the Durrandon look, is what
Yeah. It's no surprise that they're good-looking folk. You got that Targaryen and wind and sea god bloodline going. It's also the most perhaps the most familiar to the Greek myths that we've been relating a lot of these to. Given marrying sea god, wind goddess, that's similar to a lot of the immortal relationships with humans that happens in Greek myth, specifically the stuff that leads up to the Trojan War, like the marriage of Thetis to Achilles' dad, Peleus. So it's also sort of it's also kind of like Arwen from Lord of the Rings, who surrendered her immortality to marry a mortal. And there's a little bit of similarity elsewhere in this comparison, which is that Aragorn, to be worthy of Arwen before Elrond would allow the marriage, and I can't remember her mother's name, starts with a C. Aragorn had to reclaim 2 thrones in order to be worthy, so to speak. And Durin had to rebuild his castle over and over until the 7th castle became Storm's End. So there's a little bit of, having to earn it from the parents, They kept set him on this task over and over. And that's very familiar in that site. When I remember reading this myth for the first time and feeling like I was reading Greek myth. Partly that's just my familiarity with Greek myth. I'm sure there's some other myth cycles out there that also have some similarities here, but I'm speaking to what I know. If you all know something else, please share it. Even if it's a fantasy reference like Lord of the Rings, but the myth ones are cool too.
Superman had to give up his powers to marry Lois Lane. It was part of the
good point.
plot of Superman too.
Good point. Yeah, I think surrendering immortality is maybe almost a trope. It's happened enough times throughout stories of many types. Didn't what's her name surrender? There's a lot of mermaid giving up their mermaidishness to become a human. And Splash didn't Daryl Hannah give that up? No, it went the other way around. And Splash, he ended up going to the mermaid world with her at the end, didn't he? Yeah, that's right. She lived with him, but at the end they go swim off into the sea to become deep ones at the end. But also in the Witcher short story, A Little Sacrifice, there's a relationship between a mermaid and a lord, and they bicker and argue over who's gonna go live, and the others it's one's like, I literally can't breathe water. She's like, oh, excuses. So I like those comparisons. Any thoughts here on Durin or Elenai, Sean?
Not particularly.
Cool. All right. Well, we have one other thing I want to say about him. Besides perhaps Brandon, Duran is perhaps the best example of names just confusing us, because it's like all of them were named Durin. It's not like even Garth, where there was Garth and then a bunch of other names, but lots of Garths. This is just the Storm Kings were like, no, everyone's named Durin. I mean, there were a few exceptions, but they were really hardcore.
You know what? They were in Durin.
Oh my God. Good one. I approve that pun. And so that's really neat. They add to the historical confusion of the notion that there was 1,000 years of Durin, when it might have just been 1,000 years of guys named Durin. That sounds more believable, but we do have the possibility of a little of both, or a couple other houses in the Stormlands that are worth mentioning, and a different style of founding that I want to close us out with today. Consider that House Dondarrion and their purple lightning. Dondarrion, Durrandon, it kind of sounds similar. But the founding story of House Dondarrion, as told to us in The Hedge Knight, is that this scout was trying to carry an important message to the Storm King, and a pair of Dornish scouts found him and were going to kill him, but purple lightning struck them down. The scout carried his message to the Storm King. The Storm King, in receiving that message, changed his battle plans and won. Probably would have lost if he hadn't, so this was huge. And the scout was rewarded with lands and a keep that became Blackhaven, and now we have House Dondarrion. So that's their founding story. We don't even get the name of that scout. We know his name became Dondarrion. Maybe that was his first name. But it's interesting how that doesn't seem to be
obviously
important.
His first name was Don. It was Dondarrion.
So, right, that's a different style of origin story, right? Instead of some famous person that they all descend from, you sort of have the same famous person, but it's this deed, this famous, like, miraculous event that instead inspires this house rather than a person, right? So that's kind of neat, and that's a springboard for us to bring up a few similar examples or similar style categorization, such as houses that have a reputation, like the sinister repute of House Upcliff. Now, it's House Upcliff of Witch Isle. So, I mean, they're kind of fighting an uphill battle when you live on Witch Isle to not sound sinister, but there's also some examples that aren't.
What's up, Cliff?
What up, Cliff?
I don't know. What's up with you?
So in the Riverlands, the Vale, Dorne, and other sub-regions of the major regions, in other words, places where it was not all the rage of heroes. So you have places that don't have a central founding figure from the First Men, but instead have something like that, a sinister repute or an origin story like the Dondarrions, or just something else entirely. As I said before, the Vale's founding figure is Artis Arryn, but he's an Andal. He's not around yet, so prior to him, like I said, there was the Griffin King, but we don't know much about him. The Winged Knight is often confused with Artis Arryn, especially the knight part. He's kind of a bridge figure from Artis Arryn to the First Men kings of prior, but that's really its own subject, and there's not a lot of supernatural elements to that either. In the Riverlands, we have characters like Artos the Strong, Florian the Fool, Nine-Fingered Jack, Shara the Witch Queen, and the Green King of the God's Eye. None of the Riverlands houses care about descent from these figures that we know of. I haven't heard a single one of these figures mentioned in the lineage of any of the Riverlands houses. I suspect Artos the Strong is the founder or early progenitor, early figure from House Strong. But even that's just a guess, like a educated guess. Florian the Fool is a famous figure, but people don't talk about descent from him. They just talk about his story. It's an interesting story of Maidenpool and Florian and Jonquil and all that. But blood connections doesn't really seem to be important, doesn't seem to be part of it. So that's kind of interesting as well. And maybe that's part of the reason the Riverlands is the way it is. There isn't one grand unifying figure. There isn't one bloodline that can kind of trump all the others. Dorne's kind of similar. Lots of old, really old houses, not much in the way of founding figures, legendary or otherwise. We don't need really to repeat that, but I wanted to bring them up here to put them in this category like that. So, yeah.
So it kind of makes sense to me, I think. Well, I was gonna say these lands maybe don't care about it for one reason or another, but you can see other people who might not care about it, like Olenna. Like if you have something else to care about, something else worth caring about, like if you've actually accomplished something, you don't need to call back to some ancient history, like what have I done or what has my family done recently. And also someone like Olenna, who maybe is a little bit more practically minded. She doesn't care that your great grandfather or great grandfather was some warrior. Like, what have you done for me lately? You know?
Yeah.
There's this.
It's the swords of now. It's the stories help, but they can't lead, right? They can bolster, but it needs to be the swords and willpowers of today and coins of today that drive it all.
There was this moment when Olenna was sizing up Sansa, you know, when she was the prospect of Joffrey, you know, marrying Marjorie, and their conversation, and they're kind of going back and forth, and Olenna's putting her on the spot, you know, and Sansa's trying to think of how to respond. She said, Sansa's mouth, quote, Sansa's mouth open and closed. The Tyrells can trace their descent back to Garth Greenhand, was the best she could manage at short notice. And the Queen of Thorns snorted.
So can the Florents, the Rowans, the Oakharts, and half the other noble houses of the South. Garth liked to plant his seed in fertile ground, they say. I shouldn't wonder that more than his hands were green.
I love that, yeah. She's throwing shade at the old legend. She's like, yeah, we talk about it. But it's just like the putting it's kind of like how she jokes and looks down on the constant trumping of sigils and like like roses and stags and like sure, that's really it's real fancy, really that makes us great, doesn't it? Sure, she thinks it's all pretty silly, and this is
it makes her stand out as a character that she's not as concerned with all the pomp and circumstance.
She sees through it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
She's
whatever your sigil is, whatever you're related Garth Grehan, whatever. We need money for food. You need boats in the Navy. Like who's getting married. We need to figure out these decisions right now. And I don't care about some past connection to some famous person or whatever your house words are. Like what's the reality of what we need right now? She's much more practically minded, and she's in a position where she gets to be, even if some underling, if some random guard in her house spoke poorly of the roses, she probably couldn't let that go. You know what I mean? But she's in a position of power where who's going to challenge her when she makes these observations? So she's in a position where she gets to be more dismissive of this type of stuff. But but I appreciate her take.
Yeah, me too. It's like it's almost like, literarily speaking, she's sort of playing the role of, she's the wise matroness, but she's also playing the role of the fool by saying things that no one else is allowed to say, partly because of who she is. She's being an older woman, that gives you like license to say things in a lot of societies that almost anyone else can't say. And she has life experience, huge amounts of that, and she understands the way these stories work. I mean, what she's expressing here is some of these stories are exaggerated, but she also understands that they do have power. For for example, she's the one who lied about her own marriage to her own marriage history. It's like, oh yeah, I put a stop to that Targaryen marriage. Wait, wasn't he gay? Isn't that really what the big problem was?
You put a stop to that?
Yeah, it seems like the way he was born put a stop to that. But
it's also clever for her, and I think clever for Martin to write all this too, because her being more dismissive of this sort of lore and pomp and everything lowers Sansa's guard. Sansa's a little more okay telling the truth when she sees that that's what Olenna really wants. You don't have to play the game right now.
Yeah, it's
Sansa,
very calculated.
Yeah,
she's not just being frank. She wouldn't just be that frank always.
She's leveling. Yeah, she's trying to get Sansa to open up. You're totally right.
There's power in these stories, but there's also power in frankness.
Yeah, and that's what we're seeing here. And she's being frank about the stories in order to gain that leverage over Sansa to say, hey, stop quoting stuff you would just say. She's being a courtly songbird. Like Sandor would say, you're just being a little bird right now. That's what this is. Whereas Sandor would just say that bluntly to her face, Olenna's like, that's what she's doing. Here's how I can get her to shift gears and speak on a different level and open up to me. And it's a confidence game. Yeah, y'all are totally right to bring that up, because that is part of that's part of what these stories are used for in the first place. These stories are used to gain or remove confidence, to inspire, to inflame, etc. So I didn't realize how well this quote would work out here at the end, but it sure did. Good job, Sean. Sean pulled that quote. Well played. Adding on to the concept of founding legends that don't refer to specific people, we have things like House Royce and House Dane that have artifacts as they're linked to the ancient past, which somewhat reminds us of the Grey King and Naga's bones as a physical reminder of that. And these artifacts and the stories about them drive their behavior. House Royce still wears this silly bronze armor, which is cool to have and to talk about and analyze, but to actually wear it in battle is like, what are you doing, man? It's bronze. That's
inspiring confidence.
Yeah, inspiring confidence, or being silly. One or the other. I mean, it works.
In a story.
It probably does work. You're probably right, Sean. Like I'm downplaying it, but the men who are following Bronze Ron Yoyce into battle probably are inspired by it, even though it's maybe not the best idea.
Like, even if he's half as effective as a warrior, if he gets 20 other warriors to be 10% more effective, hey, that was worth it.
There you go. That's right. Got to spend money to make money. Got to spend bronze to make steel. And with House Dane, it's even more specific, more organized, right? Only certain people are worthy of this sword. It's not just the firstborn son that inherits the runic bronze armor and that makes them stand out as the inheritor of this important artifact, you got to do the right deeds. You got to be worthy of it. You have to show evidence that you're worthy of this. So different versions of a similar thing, but they both refer to the founding stories of the house, the identity of that house in a way that is not a person. Like, we don't know the name of the guy who led the Danes to follow the falling star that they found the meteor from. That guy's name isn't remembered. We got artwork of him from Michael. Michael, people have tried to, give us imagery of it, but the legend focuses on the sword and its origin and how that framed the identity of this house, not the person, not the people around that story. So 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, lots of different versions of this. George clearly has borrowed from a lot of different traditions, whether they're real world or whether they're other fantasy stories or other fiction stories. And a lot of it's just his own imagination, of course. And the way he merges it all together is very unique and just permanently George. It's like once George takes over a historical figure, it's permanently his. And we've got a few questions to finish off with today. Actually, more than a few, so let's get to them. Guilty Undertaker says, Land the Clever also parallels what the Lannisters do to the throne of all of Westeros. Oh!
Think about the children that didn't know that they were pregnant. Yeah.
True. Well said. Good catch, Guilty Undertaker.
Yeah, winkled the throne away. Yeah.
Yeah. I like that. Hari Krishnan says, if you combine... What's that, Sean?
Yeah, I'm just
Thinking
pondering
about
that, realizing how good that thought is.
Yeah, well played. Like I'm surprised I never noticed that. That's a really good one.
Remember I said it was maybe at the time it was Land the Frustrating, Joffrey the Frustrating.
So Hari Krishnan says, if you combine all the current Lannister narratives into an archetype, Lan would be a dwarf woman who is in love with her sibling. Well, where's the lie? Bryson Chung says, in terms of the Riverlands, I'd say it's because the houses with the most ancient and noble roots in there are gone, like House Mud. The ancient bloodlines aren't as celebrated there. Yeah, absolutely. And when we get to the Riverlands, that's going to be a topic. Certainly, House Mud has been extinct for a while. And we even mentioned that last time as one of the, like a tiny subtle detail to show that the Age of Heroes is back or has reemerged, is things like there's a guy in the Golden Company calling himself Mud. Like we're like 99.999999% sure that guy has nothing to do with House Mud. But just the fact that the name is coming back is emblematic of this era. Ancient claims and ancient titles coming back, old kingdoms, and all these great memories. I like that. Yeah, that's very true. And with Garth Greenhand, it's more recent. The Mud line went out thousands of years ago, whereas Garth Greenhand his line ended on the Field of Fire. That's only 300 years ago. So they're the squabbling, and they're still resentful over Aegon putting the Tyrells above everyone else, which is part of why the Reach has been not very prominent in a lot of the civil wars, because the Tyrells have never at any point had a great hold over their vassals. And this is part of why Garth Greenhand, this bloodline stuff, is at the center of it all. Sir Austin Flowers says, and here's a couple of these. We've got people who responded to our question from last week about how characters would be remembered. Current A Song of Ice and Fire characters. Sir Austin Flowers says, a little about Jon in Maester Aemon's eulogy aboard the Cinnamon Wind. Sam says that, quote, a dozen Lords Commander came and went during his years of service. This is significant because should anything happen to the library at Castle Black, Sam, having a healthy respect for Aemon and not having obsessed over the previous two counts as we all have, will attest that Jon is the 13th Lord Commander in recent living history, unlucky 13, and perhaps a candidate for the second Age of Heroes' Night's King, who was also the original 13th Lord Commander. So, well said, good said, Austin Flowers. There's a lot of little details about Jon and Aemon that align pretty well with our current topics. Yeah, how Aemon will be remembered, that's a good one. A lot of people focused on Jon and the other major characters, but yeah, like how will they remember him at the Citadel? For example, Marwyn the Mage talks about how they kind of denigrate him because of his bloodline and his interest in supernatural stuff. So maybe Aemon won't be remembered fondly at the Citadel, but Sam will remember him fondly, and if John's around, he will too, and hopefully some other people.
Yeah, I'm not as sure about the Citadel perspective, but I think which might also be not as positive as it should be. But the people in general probably barely will remember him at all. You know,
Yeah.
he didn't like conquer any lands. He didn't kill anyone with a sword. You know, he just
It was way the heck up there on the wall. I mean,
yeah. Probably a very, noble, intelligent person who maybe saved the realm from a lot of heartache and just won't be remembered for any of it.
Yeah, basically the history will cut off at the point where he goes to the wall, because certainly when he was, history will remember him around the time of the Great Council that they tried to offer him the crown on the sly, that because he's a Targaryen that was the son of Maekar and all that part will be remembered. But yeah, his time as a maester and all this stuff where he may have helped save the world, it's way more important, but not as likely to be remembered by a mile. Michael H. says, similar to Brienne the Beauty, I think Sam will be unironically remembered as the Slayer for killing the first other and establishing the differences between white and other vulnerabilities. Most importantly will be him writing these things down on some book in the Citadel, giving him a place in recorded history, perhaps giving him the opportunity to not have the record be written by someone else about him, in which case maybe Sam the Slayer will be a little less literal. Yeah. But he really did do that. I mean, he did slay. I'm surprised we didn't think of that. I'm kind of surprised Sam, Michael's the first one to mention that, or at least the first one that I've seen. What's that?
I just said slay, Sam.
Slay. Yes, slay Sam. So yeah, he does have that name, and he really did it. And that's a good conversation that happens between him and Gren when he's like, they call me the Slayer as a mock. He's like, yeah, but you really did kill that other. And when some of them are mocking you with it, but when I say it, I'm remembering that you slayed that other. I was there. When Sir Alistair calls me Aurochs, he's mocking me for being slow and dim-witted or whatever. But an Aurochs is big and strong and can protect its herd, and that's the way he likes to think about it. So yeah, it's really just in the eye of the beholder. And when you're reading history, something that looks good to you might look bad to the person writing it, and vice versa. And
I hadn't considered it either, but Sam may really be set up to be a unique historical character. If he could like hit on several different bases.
Yeah, he's done so many different things and
unique things and memorable things. Like even if he didn't do anything else, he might not have done enough to quite get remembered, especially depending on how the stories are told or if they're remembered. But it still is unique for like there is a history to the Tarleys. Like he's got some sort of like line of prestige there.
He's a Southerner, and he swore up in the north,
right? And then to go to the north, and then to go to the Citadel, and to have killed another. Like he's just sort of like. He's traveling. There's a lot of potential for him to have a very storied legend.
Yeah, if more things come out, about like the baby, for example, there's some drama involved there as well.
Yeah, he might, as have something to do with helping the realm fight Grayscale, right?
Yeah,
there was a bit of that in the show. It should be something different in the books, but there's definitely more opportunities for him to do amazing things. Also, I don't know how the people at the Citadel really look at this, and I don't know if we get something where he has a falling out with people at the Citadel. That's possible. But if I'm a maester and there's one of my maesterly compadres is doing all these things that you just described, Sean, that's a heroic maester. I would be like, yeah,
you want to prop him up.
Yeah, unless they just don't like him, which is possible. They might think of him too much of a rebel, in which case the maesters of 100 years from now might be the ones that like him, and the ones who exist in the same era as him may have stuck in their craw how different he is or how he broke conventions or
I feel like he would be thought of like a scholar warrior, right.
In
the future it would be like some maesters would look up to him and want to do the things they're writing about, and
killed an other and then wrote about it. Like that is badass.
Like consider how he might parallel to Rhaegar, right? Like
the prophecies,
especially if he keeps going on to do more and more, if he lives longer and does more stuff and continues his travels, and it may be downplayed, like you said, if the senior Citadel members are like upset at this upstart to feel like he's like tainting the reputation or stealing their thunder or whatever it is. But like you said, 100 years from now, he was ahead of his time. That might be how he was looked at.
Kind of a funny comparison for Sam would be Daeron Targaryen, the young dragon. It's just someone who wrote his own history book.
Yeah, he conquered Dorne and then
He
wrote about
did
the
the
Dornish.
axe, and then he wrote about it, which is what Sam would be doing.
Yeah, Sam doesn't have high self-esteem, so he needs a little more. He needs a few more talks with Gren. Otherwise, he's going to just write himself out. He's going to just
Yeah,
downplay
that's
his
true.
own.
I think he would just like not mention what he did. He'd be like, and then another died.
Then, then the Maesters who came after him were like, he did not. Sam the Slayer, Archmaester Sam the Slayer, was notoriously humble about his deeds. So here I am, here to set the record straight. Yeah, that's really fun. I like thinking about this. This is cool. And one more from Thomas Smithson, who says the jealous bastard of Winterfell, who sat at the wall and let his brothers die one by one, then went across the wall and made a deal with a king beyond the wall to use his army to steal the birthright away from his sisters. Jon Snow, 500 years later, lol. Yep,
Yeah,
I could see it. I could see it. And that's one thing that's great about these is it doesn't have to be one story. A variety of stories will be told about Jon Snow 500 years from now, and some of them will be like this. Some of them will call him a hero. I don't know which of there'll be more of, but I'm pretty confident there will be a variety, and it just kind of depends on like what region you're from, what values you uphold, and what version of the story you heard first when you were a child. Things like that, kind of like how it is now. Like a lot of times we hear a story when we're a kid, and that kind of frames how we think about it for a long time until maybe at some point when we're an adult, we might hear differently, we might relearn it. But we might not relearn it because we don't take a second look. So here's my way of saying it's important to take a second look sometimes. Things you learned as a child or even as a younger adult. Might be time to take a second look at some of those things.
So
see them differently now.
So should we start the episode over and take a second look?
Yes. Let's go. Let's go because everybody is definitely we're going to go compete against the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Yes, let's do that. Yeah.
Shay, you just want to take a second look at Buttered Up Land of Clever.
Closer look.
Buttered Up Lannisters and Margarine Tyrell. Oil-Enna.
Oh, nice.
All right, let's
See, it's a good thing we took a second look.
Let's slide out of here. Thank you everyone for coming. I think Sean may go grab a cat, and while he's doing that, I will mention what episodes you all could check out next because we mentioned a lot of them. If you're hearing this later, it may be time for you to check out Brandon the Builder, but if you're watching the live stream, it's not out yet. Our episode on the Comet is pretty relevant for changing of the ages and different interpretations, that whole concept. Our episode on the Night's King, as I said, has lots of talk about Night's King, Night's Queen. Serwyn of the Mirror Shield episode is out there as well. We mentioned our episodes on House Blackwood and House Manderley. There's 2 of each of those. Those are historical episodes, scripted. So basically, we touched on a lot of things today. We talked about Euron. We talked about a lot. So you could kind of pick an episode at random from our back catalog, and decent chance it's going to relate to some of this stuff. But it's kind of how it always works, isn't it? It all ties together. It's all connected. So once again, thank you all. I know a lot of you probably had Super Bowl parties to attend or what have you, so we appreciate any of y'all who still came. And if you're catching it later, we appreciate that too. You can join the discussion, as always, on Discord or Patreon or Facebook or by tweeting at us, at Dancing Sean, at Mirrorneys Not, at History of Westeros. You can do that.
Oh, we got a kitty. We got Jet today.
Jet, the black kitty.
Yes.
Jet
We have
Black.
a comment from Lord Middlefinger who said Sam could be a septic Barth.
A septic Barth.
Yeah.
Instead of septic Barth,
Yeah.
that's good.
Oh, look at that Jet.
Yeah.
She's looking so
Yeah.
pretty. The cat, the gender
see,
fluid
her.
cat.
Yeah. Yes. Loki could be a Loki
It
cat.
has her arm hanging out there.
Oh, she's just so black.
More black. Blackest black.
Yeah, what a good girl. Oh, I see her claws. I see her claws sticking out.
Yeah.
Sharp.
Our friends over at Here Be Dragons are doing the Legend of Vox Machina today. They are bravely going up against the Super Bowl, but hey, a lot of people don't care about the Super Bowl. And also thanks to Nina, thanks to Joey and Jesse and Kevin for the music. Thanks to Michael Klarfeld. Big double, extra, triple thanks to Michael today because we sure did use a lot of his images. If you're listening on the podcast version, you should go to one of our social media spots to check out these links and check out these artwork if you haven't seen them already. Some of you have seen them already. They've been around for a few years. And of course, thanks to our engineer who informed me that he's very close on the Tyrion 2 TWOW chapter audio. We haven't talked about those in a while, but we still are trying to get them done. There's various things holding them back, but
If you think
work
you have,
hasn't stopped.
If you think you have a good Euron Greyjoy, submit. Otherwise, I don't even care about your submissions right now. I just need Euron. It's so hard to find a perfect Euron.
Yeah. I actually was thinking about trying myself. I got 3 hours sleep on Saturday. My voice was particularly low.
Yeah.
And I was messing with the script. So if I have a light day of sleeping,
try again. I mean, we need someone.
Yeah. So
I always imagine you're on with more of a Mickey Mouse voice.
No, Aziz can do pretty good.
Shade of the evening. Oh.
I would love
Charnel
that.
Pitts, born again. A new god will arise from the graves. Dragonbinder. Woo.
You're going to scare the audience.
Yes, that's what the kids do not need, is to associate Disney with Euron. I mean, Mickey Mouse with Euron.
I already think
Greyjoy.
of, whenever I hear the Mickey Mouse voice and see Mickey, I just think of the South Park or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we talked about it on the podcast
Mafia
too.
boss. Mickey,
I just think of that Mickey.
That's really funny. Anyway, friends, fellow Westorians, and all you beautiful people out there, wherever you're listening to us today, we appreciate it. We're all part of this great fandom together.
Yeah.
And we'll be back soon with another episode of Valar Rereadis.
I don't want to leave because of the cat. I just want to leave it on this. No outro. Just leave it on the cat. Okay. Goodbye, everyone.